All right, it's Signpost Live Weekly. Signpost Live Monday, October 7th, 2024. And really excited for an extra long session today. I kind of thought of some of the different options. I actually have a lot of things I want to do in these Signpost Lives. I want to go deeper into some of the personality systems. I want to go into some of the topics we talked about at HDHD. I have a 2 day all day workshops, so like 12 hours of material that I've been taking notes on. The first day called Melt Your Design, the second day Meld Your Design. So I'm thinking, in future Signpost Lives to try out some of that material because it's all kind of new, never before been taught. And it's still kind of coming into formation. But today, what I want to do is actually take our attendees, which Nancy and Pockets, and if you end up wanting to, stick around, Richard, you're more than welcome. I'm going to take people through a technique that Chetan Parkin taught at the conference this year. And I'm going to be very careful not to infringe on any of his original discoveries or original copyrighted material. I'm only going to use the system because systems cannot be copyrighted, and also just out of respect for him, I don't want to step on his toes by, reading his descriptions or any of his materials. I'm simply going to be following his formulas. And so yeah, this will be great. I see your comment there, Pockets, and yeah, it's pretty exciting. He did this as a full day workshop, so he did this as a good 6 or 7 hours. We're going to try to do it in 3, and so I'll be going till 6 p.m. my time, which is 3 hours from now, basically, and but we'll take little breaks as we need to, and obviously if anyone has to drop off, no problem, and we can keep going. And if I'm, we'll see how much time folks have, and then as people join, I know some people join later on the Signpost Live. We'll get them caught up as they join. So first, I just want to frame what we'll be teaching. I'm not going to call it the same system that he does because so he has his own copyrighted system called Karma Clearing by Design, which is his own original creation. That's not what we're doing. What I am going to be doing, though, is walking through some of his system of looking at essentially what are the karmic aspects of the design, karmic aspects of the body graph, and kind of a different perspective of the body graph. For instance, those who know me know I'm very fascinated by past lives. Well, Chetan Parkin looks at particular places in the body graph for indicators of past lives. I'm also a Queen of Hearts in the Cards of the Magi, and I'm Quarter of Duality, and I love relationships. In fact, one of the 2 days of the 2 day workshop I'm working on is called Meld Your Design, all about partnership analysis. And I know people know how much I'm into partnership analysis. So obviously, I'm also very interested in love karma. What karmas do we come into this life with? And then I'm also interested in fulfilling life purpose. I'm a base 2, which itself it has the keynote of role. What role are we here to play? Which is really ultimately the question we're asking when we're talking about purpose. What role do I play to fulfill my purpose? And where do I fit in the larger scheme of things? So, his system, when he teaches this, he does karma clearing by design. I think today we will call it interpreting the karma chart, because we have a body graph. I almost want to call it a karma graph, like interpreting the body graph as a karma graph. Past life karma, love karma, destiny karma, purpose, these kinds of questions. So maybe that'll be our title today, interpreting the karma graph. And what is karma? Karma is simply the law of cause and effect. That's all it is. Something Chetan said that I really appreciated during his description of karma is that anytime you react, I think he meant by that, anytime you react unconsciously or anytime there's a reaction that, that is greater than what came in, that reaction causes new karmas to be formed. So basically, anytime you escalate, you create a new karma. Anytime someone does something and you want to get revenge on them for doing it, you create a new karma, stuff like that. And so one thing Chetan Parkin said is that he has a very wise friend who, he actually said this, his friend, one of his only people he knows who's achieved a state of no mind, and he explained human design to this person. I think this was probably somebody from the Osho community. And this person said, "Oh, it's the karmas. That's what you're looking at, is their karmas." And it's an interesting lens, right? We look at the body graph, we don't immediately think karma, but there is this idea that these are your karmas. These are the effects of previous causes. And one thing Ra says in his base materials is that everything is reaction, all the way back to the Big Bang. That reaction is fundamental. Actually, one of the keynotes of base 1 is reaction. And yet, if we react by escalating things, if we react by trying to get revenge, if we react unconsciously and continue the cycle of karma, that's very different than the reaction of absorbing what has happened, digesting what has happened, processing what has happened, gaining awareness, and bringing awareness to what is happening. And so I think a lot of this does have to do with how do we react. And so much of the human design practice is, if you're waiting to respond, if you're waiting for an invitation, if you're waiting for clarity, all these things, then you're not reacting the way you were before. Because before there was a sort of knee-jerk reaction, a reflexive reaction. That was the reaction of, something has happened, now I must do this. I'm uncomfortable, now I must, initiate. Or I'm feeling emotional, I must make a decision. And what is human design doing if not teaching us how to abstain from making decisions until the right time, which is a way of working with our karmas more intelligently. So the one we're going to start with, I have a few notes here. Basically, we're going to start with past life karma. This is something that I love, that I'm very interested in. And so the format we're going to follow is, and if you have a pen and paper or a notes app, it's a good time to open it. We're essentially going to follow a format of looking at different placements in your body graph. So have your body graph handy. We're going to look at those placements. You can share with me what those placements are. And then I'm going to give you keynotes. And these are keynotes that are effectively the same as Richard Rudd's Gene Keys keynotes. And I hadn't realized this, but Chetan Parkin told the story of how he was talking with Rudd and they were developing new keynotes. Ra always encouraged to write your own Rei Vi Ching and so on. And Chetan was actually the one who said, well, if we're going to do keynotes, we're going to need more than just one keynote. We're going to need to sort of get the polarity of the shadow frequency, and then we're going to need to find the key that gets to the higher frequency, the high vibe. And that eventually turned into the shadow, the gift, and the city, with the caveat that Chetan Parkin's understanding is slightly different from Rudd's, but that they were collaborating together. And that's something I hadn't realized. I knew they were friends. I didn't realize they'd collaborated. Basically, as Chetan tells the story, he was developing this with Rudd, and then Rudd called him one day and said, I've got it. I got the whole download. I got the whole thing. And basically sent over all of these keynotes, basically fully formed, to Chetan, which is really an incredible feat. I mean, just thinking of Rudd getting this download of all of these keynotes. And I guess the one sort of distinction is just that Chetan Parkin does interpret them in a very specific way, that there's a polarity between an introverted and extroverted axis of the so-called shadow frequency. That polarity goes between too little and too much, and it ping-pongs back and forth. And this is very similar to what Rudd teaches as well, but just to kind of clarify. Then what Rudd calls the gift, Chetan calls the key, and says the key is what essentially stops the ping-ponging. It's the third way. It's the synthesis. You have thesis, antithesis. The key gives you the synthesis that unites the opposites, and then you get to what Rudd calls the siddhi. And I think the term that Chetan Parkin uses is just high vibe. You just get to the high vibe of it. So basically there's this low vibe, low foundational vibes that are ping-ponging back and forth. There's a key that synthesizes the two of them together, and then that brings you to the high vibe. So there's 4 keynotes total. There are the 2 low foundational keynotes, the kind of shadow keynotes, which ping-pong back and forth. Then we have the key, and then we have the high vibe. Okay, and then what terms we're going to be using, I believe these are mostly identical, if not entirely identical, to the terms used in Gene Keys, I believe. But Chetan did mention that he may have modified a few of these. So these are technically keynotes given by Chetan Parkin, but I believe these were mostly given to him by Richard Rudd. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the unconscious moon. And so we want to look at the unconscious moon gate and line. And what Chetan Parkin says is that the unconscious moon is very connected to our past lives. It's connected, essentially, it's very similar to what we would say in, conventional astrological analysis of what we call the personality moon, which is that it's somatic and it's this deep inner kind of lived life experience of the body and so on. But when it's on the unconscious side, the design side, Chetan Parkin says this actually has more to do with our ancestral memories and with, let's see if I can see any terms that he uses. He basically says it holds feeling memories, our past life feeling memories. And so the feeling memories of the unconscious moon are not even just feelings we've had from our own lives or childhood. They're feelings that we may have had in past lives that we've sort of kept. And for those who attended Raphael Wiseman's presentations at HDHD, he works with these as well. He works with trapped emotions from past lives as well as from this life. But he can track down, which emotions are from this life and which emotions are from past lives. And he'll even track them quite far back. I mean, I know in one session he had with an HDHD attendee this year, there were trapped emotions going, 15 or more generations back, and had to do with starving to death in a past life and all the emotions that went with that, the feelings of abandonment and being left and things of that nature. So that can possibly show up in the unconscious moon. So Pockets, Nancy, and if you're here, Richard, please post your unconscious moons or say them on voice or put them in the chat. Okay, Pockets is 8, line 5. And we'll start there. So for Pockets, gate 8, so we're going to look at the unconscious moon low foundational vibes, then we're going to look at the key, and then we're going to look at the high vibe. So starting with low foundational vibes. The low foundational vibes of gate 8 go between wooden and artificial. So what you'll want to write is low foundational vibes, wooden, artificial. They kind of ping pong back and forth. And line 5, we have keynotes of sort of the low vibe of line 5 as the victim, or the kind of almost like that persecutor, victim, savior triangle. So either the savior or the victim, either I need to be saved or I am saving. That's sort of that ping-ponging, right? Keynotes given by Chetan Parkin. He says they are manipulative and impractical and that they foster a false image of themselves. So these are sort of the keynotes of the low vibe of 5, and so this is sort of the past life karma and the feeling karma that you've incarnated with is this movement between the wooden and the artificial, and then with the 5th line there, victim, rescuer themes, impractical themes. It's almost as if you only get to incarnate with certain energies if you have that karma, right? So this idea is that there's like your design moon, you can kind of come in on that line because you have that karma in your past. And so, yeah, I guess as we're examining the Karmagraph, the body graph as a Karmagraph, we'll now consider what is the key to resolving that tension between the wooden and the artificial. And according to Chetan Parkin, he gives this key as style, that style is the way out. I guess if we think about wooden and artificial, wooden like a puppet, artificial like something fabricated and disingenuous and not genuine, and yet style is the mastery of appearances, right? The 8 is on the throat side of that channel. Actually, we've had the 1-8 in transit these last few days. And so style is what saves or rescues or redeems. Style is the redeeming factor that is the key that sort of elevates the bouncing between woodenness and artificiality. And so this is the first key that you're really going to want to underline is style. When you're feeling the heaviness of the deep past life feelings that are making you feel wooden or making you go into an artificial kind of, automaton way of being, remember that you actually have this great gift of style, and that style is what's going to elevate that. And through style, you're going to get to the more evolved fifth line themes of having leadership, of having love of humanity, of basically, he wrote the keynote, appreciate expansive concepts, appreciate your expansive concepts. So, basically the style is what's going to save you from that lower vibe of the fifth line and of gate 8, and bring you into the keynotes that we're so familiar with already, which will be keynotes of practicality and things like that we give to the fifth line. And then ultimately the high vibe keynote is exquisiteness. So if you've written down 4 words, those words would be wooden, artificial, and then the key being style, and then leading to exquisiteness. And the idea that Chetan Parkin gives in his work is to focus on the key, because the key is what gets you to the high vibe. You don't just focus on exquisiteness, you focus on style, but style brings you to exquisiteness. Now I see for Nancy, she has an unconscious moon in gate 52, line 2. Well, first I'm going to write the 8 key is style, and 8 high vibe is exquisiteness. Okay, so Nancy has 52 as her unconscious moon. So this 52 is going to be what you've brought with you into this life from past life karmas, past life feelings, and sort of your emotional undercurrent. I almost even wonder if it's ancestral. I talked a little bit with Chetan about this, and it seems that both your literal genetic DNA and your lineage of your ancestors, like your literal lineage, and then also your spiritual past lives, somehow have this interesting correlation with each other, so that you tend to heal ancestral trauma when you heal past life trauma, and so on, because they are both somehow in lockstep with each other. Like you can only incarnate in certain bloodlines because those bloodlines have experienced the karmas that your past lives have experienced. So through some law of resonance, you end up being born into that family of origin and that ancestral lineage, because that particular ancestral lineage supports the karmas that you've experienced in your past lives through different ancestral lineages, right? Okay, so gate 52 has the foundational, let's see, what are the terms? What are we calling it here? I guess the foundational low vibe, or the, I'll turn here, yeah, low foundational vibes, right? So the low foundational vibes of 52, stuck and restless. I'm going to write that down. So stuck and restless are sort of the shadows of 52, going between stuck and restless. I know James Alexander said most people with gate 52 will have some period of their life of being imprisoned or trapped or stuck in some ways. I mean, it is part of the cross of healing, and part of healing is being stuck. You're stuck by your illness. You need to recuperate, and you can't just keep moving in life. It sits you down. I mean, I also think 52 may have something to do with depression, not in a negative sense, but how James Hillman talks about depression. He says, people call depression a dysfunction. That's not true. Depression functions. It sits you down and makes you damn miserable. And that's its function. That's what it's here to do. It's here to put you in that stuck mode where you then have the restlessness, the stuck, the restless, the stuck, the restless. And being second line, the less evolved version of the second line, can be very angry. It can project a lot of anger out in the world. It can be very oblivious. We know this about the second line having sort of blinders on. Chetan Parkin gives the keynote of eating disorders. I don't know where he got this from, but it's something that'd be interesting to track, certainly. And then he gives the keynote of unaware. And these are very basic keynotes that should be familiar to us from our study of human design. We know the second line can be very unaware. It can be very oblivious. It can have blinders on. It can be, it can be somewhat unintrospective. It's not like the first line, which is introspecting. The second line is just sort of doing. So busy doing, it doesn't want to think about it. And so that's the sort of less evolved frequency of the second line. So 52.2, going between being stuck and restless, and this is sort of the default foundational vibe of it coming in. And then there's the key, and the key is restraint, and realizing that the restraint is what resolves this. That restraint is the key that's going to bring about the true magic of gate 52 and bring about its highest vibe. And its highest vibe is stillness. So 52 key is restraint, 52 high vibe is stillness. And so these are kind of the ways that we're going to be going through these gates, is really giving you the keys that you can use to sort of analyze your body graph as a karma graph. And then when you're feeling stuck and restless, focus on restraint. You know, pockets, if you sense that wooden artificial ping pong, focus on style. I mean, you have a killer style, and I see that about you. And I think realizing that style is not just some superficial thing. Style is actually the key to resolve ancestral trauma. It sounds funny, right? But actually, it is the solution. The solution isn't to reject and hate the energy that brings about woodenness and artifice, right? It's not to reject that energy. It's to realize it's the same energy that brings about style. And, you know, pockets, you have a wicked sense of style in the best possible way. I've always appreciated your style from when we first met. And I think that's something that gate 8 can really bring with it, and it can bring that exquisiteness. And, you know, 52 can be ping-ponging between stuck and restless, but, oh yeah, I see that there. But it can also bring about, through restraint, you can get to that highest vibe of stillness, which is such a rare quality in this world. I mean, to actually, I'm a 52 design sun, so I love 52. I mean, it's my grounding in this world. I'm grounded in my stillness. Yeah, so this is kind of how we do it. We go through, and of course, Richard, if you feel like jumping in at any point, you certainly can. And yeah, so we looked at the 52.2, we looked at the 8.5. So let's now look at, we're kind of going through the past life material, and then we're going to get into particularly placements that have to do with love and relationships. And this is sort of, before we get to that, we need to look at the stage. And so Chaitan uses the design moon as sort of our fundamental background of our feelings. It's like if the personality moon is the feelings from our upbringing and the feelings of our somatic lived life experience, the design moon is sort of the feelings of our ancestral trauma, our ancestral feelings, trapped emotions from past lives, trapped emotions from ancestors, and things of that nature. And it was really profound for me how Raphael Wiseman spent 3.5 hours doing clearing of trapped emotions Sunday night, and then Chaitan Parkin did his karma clearing Monday. And then Tuesday we had Raphael back to do another 2.5 hours of clearing trapped emotions for people. So it was like a 3-day whammy of clearing. Because something I'm not going to be doing, but something that Chaitan also does in his karma clearing, is actually clear these karmas through a practice he's developed. But I'm just going to be using the system because, again, I think out of respect for him, I don't want to use any of his original creations, but I know that systems are meant to be studied and shared, and so I feel comfortable showing his system, with the caveat that I'm not actually teaching karma clearing by design. I'm teaching, what are we calling it? Investigating the Karmagraph, something like that. Looking at the body graph as a Karmagraph. Okay, so the next placements that we look at are the conscious and unconscious Plutos. So Pluto, it has to do with transformation, and we know this from archetypal astrology. We know that Pluto is the planet of transformation. It's very transformative, and so looking at the potential for transformation in our lives, and also the sort of karmic backdrop that we have brought with us, and basically you can almost think of it as like, what potential do we have to transform in this life? The Pluto gives us the potential to transform not only ourselves, but others. One interesting thing that astrologers do is they'll actually, some astrologers anyway, will look at Pluto as the generational planet, right? That Pluto has this special significance of being this 20-year per sign planet that really like to talk about like the Pluto and Gemini generation. Authors who had Pluto and Gemini include most of the top literary authors of all time ever. Like if you look at all the most famous writers, people consider the best books of all time, it's this one 20-year segment of people born with Pluto and Gemini. People like Nabokov, who did Lolita, famously, Vladimir Nabokov. Let's see, he was born in 1899. So it must have been, that Pluto and Gemini generation must have been right around then. And you have all of these famous writers of Pluto and Gemini, and I think it's interesting because what do we say? We say these writers transformed the landscape of the world forever. They transformed the literary landscape. They transformed writing forever. Writing would never be the same after them, and so on. And so I just want to put this in context that Pluto is not only your potential for personal transformation, but also the potential for transforming the world. And so it is almost like before you were born, you incarnate according to your karmas with a certain potential to transform yourself and others. And that is seen in the Pluto. And that is sort of dictated by the Pluto gate and line that you come in on. And so this is almost how these are the constraints. It's like the outcome is not fixed, but the constraints are fixed. And the outcome is still to be determined by how you live your life and what decisions you make and how much work you do and how you navigate all of these things. But the constraints are fixed. I mean, this is almost like a solution to no choice. It's like, there's no choice what line you came in on. This very narrow line that fixes your potential. But no choice doesn't mean the potential has already been realized. It simply means the potential has a certain fundamental constraint on it. And if everything is about constraints and outcomes, the constraint can be known in advance, but the outcome cannot. It has to be lived. And the outcome will ultimately be based as much on how much you've learned as anything, right? I mean, no choice is real, but so is learning. And learning changes things. Something that I liked that Chetan Parkin kept saying is like, he would say that he doesn't like the term no choice, he likes the term choiceless awareness. And I believe it's basically saying that choice may not be real, but change is real. And change happens choicelessly. But the awareness shifting has some sort of interaction with change. I see we've been joined by Lasita, so we're going to do a special session today. Thank you so much for joining. We just had the transit report from Richard, and what we're essentially going to do today is go through an investigation of the body graph as a karma graph. And this is something that we're drawing from the work of Chetan Parkin, and yet also respectfully allowing, not stepping on any toes, allowing his practice to be his own practice, and those, of course, who want to learn his practice are welcome to do so with him, because his practice also involves other things like guided meditations and karma clearing techniques, and also all of his interpretation. And I'm leaving out his interpretive layer. But what we are doing is following the formula, both out of respect for him and also because formulas can't be copyrighted. It's a system, right? And we're going to be exploring whether these formulas have value, and I think they do. So if you'd like to join in, you're more than welcome to post in the chats. If you'd like to just watch, that is completely fine. What we're doing is looking at some of the keynotes that Chetan Parkin developed and also was given by Richard Rudd, his personal friend. And so these are keynotes for particular placements in the body graph that we're reading as karmic in some sense. I mean, really the whole thing is karmic, right? Because all karma means is cause and effect. And what are mechanics if not the study of cause and effect? Okay, wonderful. You'll be watching. Excellent. But what we've looked at so far, we looked at the design moon, which basically what we're doing is we're trying to see if there are additional hints in the body graph that might hint at something more than just the normal, usual interpretive value, right? So the way that Chetan Parkin understands the design moon through the lens of karma is that it relates not like the personality moon, which would be our own feelings, maybe trapped emotions we've had from childhood or feelings from things we've experienced or witnessed, but actually trapped emotions from our ancestors as well as past lives. And one of the things I mentioned that I thought was really fascinating is that it's almost as if, and this was from a discussion with Chetan, but I think others have said this as well, that there's a confluence or even a sort of symmetry between past lives and ancestral trauma or ancestors. So it's almost as if you can only incarnate into a certain ancestral lineage if the ancestors in that line of DNA had the experiences and created the karmas that sympathize with or have some connection to past life karmas. So if you experience something in a past life, you will then reincarnate into a bloodline that experienced a similar experience. And so something, and I've actually spoken with, I mentioned earlier that Raphael Wiseman did an incredible 3.5-hour healing session for HDHD attendees on Sunday of the event. Chetan Parkin then did his karma clearing on Monday, and then Raphael did his, he came back on Tuesday for those who were still in town for the post-conference to do another 2.5 hours of clearing. And so it was kind of like this incredible 3-day event of healing. And something that Raphael talked about is that when you heal ancestral trauma, it actually heals it for the ancestors and also for the children and for people down that bloodline. And when you heal past life trauma, it also has it's almost a domino effect of different repercussions. So it was fascinating to me that so much of Raphael's work was sort of distinguishing between trapped emotions that were experienced or witnessed in this life, which I guess would be the personality moon, versus trapped emotions that are inherited ancestrally or experienced or witnessed in past lives, which is more the design moon. And so it's just kind of interesting to think of the design. It almost adds this mystical layer to the design, that the design has a long tail that stretches back into our ancestral past. So the design moon, the unconscious moon, that very much is our inherited past life feelings, trapped emotions from the past life, and so on. And then the design Pluto is sort of the potential for transformation along with the personality Pluto. And so I was explaining just when you joined that we were kind of I was looking at Pluto's and saying how Pluto stays in the same sign for about 20 years. And so astrologers have picked up on Pluto as a generational planet that very much has the potential not only for personal transformation, but for transformation of the world. And I was saying, for instance, how the Pluto and Gemini generation of writers, people say of them that they transformed writing forever. They transformed literature forever. And so each of us has this potential to both have personal transformation as well as to express transformation in the world or to facilitate transformation in the world. So we're going to look at the unconscious Pluto now. So Pockets and Nancy, if you'll tell me your unconscious Pluto gate and line. And then we'll look at, we'll just look a little bit about the potential for transformation there. And kind of sort of the constraints. You know, I was saying that the potential is fixed, but whether that potential will be realized or not is indeterminate. And that depends on how much we learn and how much we bring, awareness to things and so on. So, okay, so we have Pockets unconscious Pluto is 32.2, Nancy's a 28.1. So we'll do the 32 first. So what Chetan Parkin calls the low foundational vibes in his terminology. I love how formal and casual he is at the same time. Like he brings a certain a certain presentation of things, but also he calls it things like low vibes. But we know what he's talking about here. So the low foundational vibes of 32, the keynotes he gives are essentially the ping-ponging between disjointed and fundamentalist. And so at the low level, he basically sees it always as underdoing and overdoing, and underdoing and overdoing. And it's this thesis, antithesis that bounce back and forth until there's some resolution, which is the synthesis. And so the low foundational vibes of 32 go between being disjointed and being fundamentalist. It's sort of maybe like not rigid enough and then too rigid or something like that. And then the second line, we see that in its less evolved form is oblivious. It's very unaware, unreflective, unintrospective. And so this is sort of the karma coming in, is that the unconscious Pluto, the sort of inherited karma connecting to the past lives, is going to be disjointed and fundamentalist until it can be resolved by a synthesis. And so part of our goals here, part of what we're trying to do, practicing human design and learning about ourselves and just learning how to deepen into our empathy for the world and for ourselves, and all of these things that we practice are really to try to synthesize and not reject or fight against these energies, but to bring them together, to hold the union of opposites. This is something that Carl Jung talked a lot about. Be able to withstand the opposites. It's kind of like that dynamic deconstructive psychotherapy technique where they prevent you from using the term should, because should splits. So if I say, oh, I want to eat that ice cream, but I shouldn't eat it, well, that is splitting. Actually, I want to eat the ice cream and I want to not eat the ice cream. I have two desires that I affirm. And by affirming these two conflicting desires, I hold the tension of the opposites together. So holding the disjointed with the fundamentalist, not saying, I hate being disjointed. Well, then you ping pong to the fundamentalist. I hate fundamentalists. Well, then you ping pong back to the disjointed. It's kind of like out of the frying pan into the fire until a synthesis occurs. And so the 32 key, the synthesis key, is conservation. And this is the keynote given by Chetan Parkin. And so thinking that conservation really solves the problem somehow of being disjointed and being fundamentalist, that both of these are one-sided solutions, but the only true solution is the one that integrates the both of them or holds both of them in tension together, and that is through conservation, and that leads to veneration. So realizing that the Pluto in 32 generation, or at least the unconscious Pluto in 32, is sort of the inherited potential for transformation that's going to ping-pong between being disjointed and fundamentalist until this key is realized consciously, and until it's witnessed and sort of being able, given its space to unfold in the world. And so if we ask, Pluto and 32 generation people, what are they here to do? Well, they're here to conserve. They're not here to be fundamentalists. Probably a lot of them are. They're not here to be disjointed rebels fighting against the fundamentalists, although probably a lot of them are. They're really here to conserve. And what happens when that conservation occurs? Veneration. And it's interesting that he uses these keynotes for 32. I mean, I don't usually think of this lineage in 32, but it makes sense. It goes up to memory, and 4426, it's part of this. It's really interesting, what is it, the stream of smell, right? And even how a smell can take you back to an early memory, and what smell has to do with conservation and ultimately with veneration. Definitely some deeper layers that can be explored and deconstructed with these keynotes. But for now, Pockets, I would simply say that if you're feeling disjointed, fundamentalist, unaware, oblivious, and lacking the potential for transformation, for actually making real lasting change, that conservation is your key. Now, could you also, let's both post our conscious Plutos as well. I know that a lot of people have the same gate, sometimes even the same line for both. So let's go ahead and post those just to see if they change. And if not, maybe we'll finish with the conscious Pluto for Pockets and then move on to Nancy's. So 32.6, okay. So yeah, Chetan didn't really make too much of a distinction between the unconscious and conscious Plutos. He just said that these together represent the potential for transformation of self and others. And I did really love that he did bring in the notion of others, because as I mentioned, it's kind of like that be the change you want to see in the world thing. When we look at the Pluto and Gemini generation, they radically transformed literature forever. You couldn't write the same kind of book before Nabokov that you could write after Nabokov. It's like that great quote from Walter Benjamin, known in English as Walter Benjamin. He said, a masterpiece either creates a new genre or destroys an old one. And I love this idea that the masterpiece is sort of the final word of an old genre. Like Sopranos, completely deconstructs mafia shows. Nobody can make another mafia movie after Sopranos, you know? I mean, Godfather created the genre, Sopranos destroyed it, lovingly, right? But it's like that's the power of transformation. That's the real power of Pluto. Not only personal transformation, but transforming the world, ruining it for everyone else in a loving, positive way, right? Sopranos was such a masterpiece, nobody can ever make another, mafia show like that. So, okay. So looking at 32.2 and then 32.6, the less evolved form of the sixth line is separated. The keynote that Chetan Parkin gives is head on legs, that the sixth line is just a head on the legs, it's disembodied. They say, that's interesting, but it's a way of dismissing, dismissive. We have words like aloof. And then he put the keynote of distrust, that the less evolved sixth line is distrusting of anything. And he also said carrying the whole world, which is so funny. It's kind of like carrying the world from an aloof place. But again, the low vibe, the foundational low vibe can be cured sort of by this key of conservation, so that the conservation is going to basically allow to get to the veneration where you're no longer feeling separate. Keynotes for the more evolved from Chetan Parkin are enjoying being in the body, letting go, guiding others, soul retrieval, and looking for what's real, looking for what's authentic. So this is the sixth line when it's more evolved. And then we see for the second line when it's more evolved is more natural, relaxed, curious, playful. And so these are very similar to Ra's keynotes. Ra obviously talks about the sixth line. That's the second line as the natural. He talks about the sixth line as being very authentic when they've overcome their sort of lower hypocritical nature, that they're ultimately here to be authentic. So I guess, and also, in the sixth line coming off the roof, comes back into the world and is no longer aloof and distant and removed. So this is very compatible with core human design teachings. It's simply saying that when you're looking at the potential for transformation, you're not going to really be able to change yourself and your life and your surroundings and the world until these keys are embraced. And the key here being conservation. So it's like realizing that you don't have to be a fundamentalist. You don't have to be disjointed. You can somehow transcend the two of those or integrate the two of those. It's very Hegelian. It almost feels like this thesis, antithesis that are constantly fighting. And then ultimately there's a synthesis that goes beyond those two opposites. And that synthesis is the key that brings you into the fullest potential of that energy. So for Nancy, she has 28.1 and 28.3. So 28 ping-pongs between being hollow and gambling. So 28 low foundational vibes, hollow and gambling. And so this is taking the risk and going for it, but then also this hollowness, this emptiness. I think that makes a lot of sense when we think of not the healthy, beautiful emptiness of gate 55, its mirror, but the sense of purposelessness or the sense of having a hollow life where it doesn't really matter enough. And going between, it's like, my life is hollow, so I better gamble, right? It's kind of going pinging back and forth. Or I've been gambling, so now my life is hollow. I mean, it can work both ways, but there can definitely be this out of the frying pan into the fire. My life feels hollow. I better take a risk to try to find purpose. But then also I took all these risks, and now I've been left with this hollowness of what has it really brought me? And so it's kind of ping-ponging back and forth between the hollowness and the gambling. And then the first and third lines, the first line has fears of confrontation, it has insecurity, it has survival issues, it can be very secretive, hiding. This is sort of the less evolved form. These are some of the keynotes given by Chetan Parkin. And then the third line, shameful, greedy, non-committal, things of that nature. And he has some other keynotes as well, but I won't share all of those just out of respect for his work. But I mean, the keynotes ultimately are part of the system, and these are not that different from Ra's keynotes. We know that the third line deals with shame. We know that the first line can have insecurity, right? So these are sort of the problems is the insecurity and the shame are preventing the potential for change. And so you might have this sort of fundamental low foundational vibe of, I can't really change the world. I can't really make a difference. I can't really facilitate transformation because I'm insecure and I'm shameful and non-committal and things of that nature. And ultimately that leads to the ping-ponging of the hollow and the gambling. So what is the key for 28? The key is totality. And this is a really interesting one for me. I had to think a lot about this because I have 28. I have Saturn there. And I had to think about, I have personality Saturn 28 too. And I had to kind of think about what is totality. It's kind of, I guess, that the gambling still isn't giving oneself totally. That it's still, I think I actually took some notes on it. Let me see. I have some notes on totality here, since I have that as well. I'm not sure where they are. Here, oh, maybe it's here. Here it is. Just a moment here. That totality was kind of an interesting. Okay, I didn't really have much notes. I took like a couple notes, but that's about it. But because that's a big one for me is my personality Saturn in 28 too. That I also deal with this feeling of emptiness, of hollowness in life, and then wanting to take risks and gamble to try to fill up life with purpose, and pinging back and forth, and then realizing that totality is the key, that actually the gambling isn't total enough. It's almost like it's risking, but it's like a calculated risk. And so the totality of almost like total commitment. I know commitment is in 29, not 28, but I almost feel like there's some connection there. Of course, being its polarity, 29-30 or polarity, but it's neighbor, I guess we could say. So 28, it's an interesting keynote. I'd be curious to hear what you think of this, but how does totality resolve the tension between hollowness and gambling? 28 key is totality. And then ultimately leading to the 28 high vibe, which is immortality. So I also like that Chetan Parkin points out, you don't focus on the high vibe to get there. You don't focus on immortality to get there. That can actually lead to the pinging between the hollowness and the gambling. My life feels hollow, so I'm going to gamble because I want to achieve immortality. Of course, not literal immortality, but legacy, making a lasting change in the world, making art, right? Art is a very 28 activity because art can achieve something like immortality. I mean, there are still cave paintings from 35,000 years ago. There's a wonderful lecture by Gilles Deleuze. I'll write this in the chat here. It's called The Creative Act. You can find it on YouTube. And he's asked, what is art? And he says, art is fundamentally resistance. And it resists all sorts of things. There's political art that resists oppression. There's art that resists oversimplified, homogenized views of the way that things should be. There's art that resists the control mechanisms of the church and state. But then going further, art resists death. Look at the resistance to death that art signifies, that you can make a piece of art that outlives the artist. And what is art if not the thing that outlives the artist? And then ultimately he says something very profound. He says art at its core, as representative of resistance, is perhaps the function of the greatest resistance of all, the resistance to the separation of the sacred and the profane. And I just love that description of art, that art makes you shamelessly enjoy it, that art makes you sort of come down off your high horse and experience it, because so often we say this is sacred, that's profane, this is good, that's bad, the sort of moralizing quality, and that art is what resists those separations. And it says, oh, you've said that this isn't sacred? I'll show you how this oil spill can be sacred. I'll show you how this this plastic bag blowing in the wind can be sacred for those who've seen, American Beauty. Okay, so 28, immortality is ultimately what it reaches for, but trying to reach that immortality directly will only lead to the ping-ponging between the hollowness and gambling. So the key is totality, and I would definitely be curious to hear how this word totality is understood. If anyone wants to comment on that, if you have any comments, Nancy, or if anyone wants to jump on voice or on text, because I have gate 28 also, and that's one that I've thought about. And then looking at the lines, we looked at 1 and 3 and how they can be insecure and ashamed and all of these things. And then, but then, the more evolved form, the first line, comfortable with fears, stands up for themselves. And then one that I really liked that Chetan Parkin wrote for his keynotes is tactile, giving and receiving touch. I'm a first line design, and I've noticed how as I've become more comfortable giving and receiving touch, I do think that is something that I've evolved towards, and that there can be a real discomfort with that and a fear of being tactile that can set in for the first line. And then for the third line, learning quickly from making mistakes, being very adaptable, more evolved, being all in, which also sounds kind of like totality. And then the keynote Chetan Parkin gives here, finding humor in your own life. So I do think that is sort of the more developed, more evolved version of the third line, finds a lot of humor. Okay, well, before we continue on, I'd like to just open up to any discussion and check in if people are following along. Oh, I see, a couple comments here. Wonderful. Nancy says, the illusion is the totality, and so is the delusion. The out of totality is totaling the reality. Right, so there is basically the totality is maybe embracing all of it. It's like the escape from the hollowness isn't to try to get away from the hollowness, but it's to accept the hollowness is just as meaningful as the fullness. And it's not to stop taking risks, but it's to take the even greater risk, which is to remain in full embrace of the totality, not splitting it. Pockets also comments from Gene Keys, the gift of totality means to embrace the whole of your nature and the whole of life, the pleasure and the pain. So thank you for that, Pockets. Yeah, I do see that is something that, the idea of 28 is almost like, my life is empty and meaningless, so I better take a risk to bring it meaning. If I don't take this risk, it'll just remain meaningless. But the totality is embracing even the meaninglessness, even the absurdity. When I think of Gate 28, I really think of the author Paul Auster. I don't know if he was a 28. Maybe he was a 28 son or something, right? They're Scorpios, right? He certainly seems like he could be. But he wrote so much about loss and about absurdity and the meaninglessness of loss. His books are almost an antidote for people saying everything has a reason, right? Everything is for the best. There's a sort of toxic positivity, spiritual bypassing. I really like the quote, I can't remember who said it, but they said, obviously it's not true that everything is for the best, and yet if you can find no good in things, you've also failed. So it's like holding both at once, realizing that, Paul Auster, one of my favorite books of his, he's in so many good books, the New York trilogy, and Moon Palace is one of my favorites, Mr. Vertigo, just incredible books. One of my favorites is called Book of Illusions. And in it, the premise is a man whose wife and 2 children have died in a plane accident. It's really ironic, not even ironic as much as just tragic that he's racing to get them to the airport, and they almost miss the plane, and at the last minute he gets them on the plane, and then they die in this plane crash. And that's all in the first 2 pages. So I'm not spoiling the book. This is the premise. But then it's how does he process this? And, obviously to tell him, well, it happened for the best, is just the most crass, absurd, sort of cruel joke, right? Everything happens for the best, And it's a beautiful book because it goes through in the first few pages his multiple years of grief. And you kind of get this amazing foundation where you're starting 5 pages in and you feel like you've already read a whole book, because it's really giving a sort of synopsis of how he goes through the stages of grieving. I mean, he grows a beard and stops shaving, and he's given all the money in the world because he's given $500,000 in insurance settlements, which makes it worse, right? It makes it actually worse, because then he doesn't have to work, so there's no impetus to encourage him to actually develop out of his grief. He's able to just fully waste away. At one point, he's putting on his wife's clothing. He's really lost it, right? He's doing anything he can to not let go of them. And I think it's very 28, because it's like he experiences the deep hollowness of life, the meaninglessness of life, the absurdity that he's devoted his whole life to the love of his wife and children, and they've just been taken from him for no reason at all, right? And this reasonlessness, this meaninglessness, and it just really leads to some really dark places. But then he finds humor in that darkness. He laughs for the first time after about 3 years, and through that laughter, he, I guess as Ra would say, he chases the laughter. He follows this figure who makes him laugh, who's an absurd 1920s silent film comedian, kind of modeled after Charlie Chaplin to a degree. So it's a really interesting book. I mean, that's all in the first few pages. Actually, much of it takes place in New Mexico. But I think of Paul Auster when I think of this absurdity and asking us, can we really embrace the totality? Yes, we love life when it's full. Can we love life when it's hollow? Yes, we love life when we've risked and won, but what about when we've risked and lost? So yeah, as you shared, Pockets, from the Gene Keys, the gift of totality, to embrace the whole of your nature and the whole of life, the pleasure and the pain. Okay, well, let's continue on. I'm going to grab a glass of water. I think what we can do is, I'm just going to pause the recording and then we'll start it back up. So we're going to continue on looking at some of the love karma. So, again, I'm not going to be doing the karma clearing that Chetan does. That is his patented system. I'm just going to be looking at the body graph as a karma graph using the keynotes that he developed with Rudd, or that Rudd downloaded, as Chetan put it, and basically going through some of Chetan Parkin's interpretation of the planetary placements. So take a very short break. When we come back, we will look at Venus and Mars in particular, and then if we have time, I think we can get to Jupiter. We'll do Venus, Mars, and Jupiter when we get back. And basically, this is going to be looking at different aspects of our relationship karma and our relationship to love with Venus, our relationship to defense with Mars and where we're defensive, and I guess even what in Gene Keys they call the core wound of the design Mars. And we'll look at Jupiter, which is our attitudes towards wealth. And just one final caveat, one little point here, then we'll take a short break. During the conference, someone asked Karen Curry Parker how that she reconciles so much of her discussion of attitudes with the idea in human design that we shouldn't trust the mind, and that everything in human design is about a practice of trusting the inner authority, which obviates the need to look at attitude. And how could she be talking so much about our attitudes when, attitudes are mental? And she said, she was really wonderful about it. She said, well, actually, attitudes aren't mental at all. Attitudes are in the body. And there's some support for that here, because we are looking at unconscious attitudes, the planetary placements that have sort of instilled attitudes on the design side. Like the unconscious Jupiter being your unconscious wealth attitude, or the design Mars being an unconscious defensiveness, or the design Venus being an unconscious love attitude. So I really liked Karen Curry Parker's reply, because it was kind of to be honest, kind of a trolling question, kind of a little bit of a slap, right? Like, how can you be talking about attitudes when we in human design know that attitudes make no difference at all because they're mental? And she said, but attitudes are in the body. So I thought that was really, really profound. All right, I'll be back in about 5 minutes. I'm just going to grab a beverage. I think just get a little bit of water, maybe a coffee, and I will return shortly. All right. Does anyone have any thoughts before we continue, or shall we jump right into love karma? I know love karma is a topic that's been very fascinating for me. We can start unless anyone has any comments, anything they'd like to share. So yeah, what we've done so far, just a little overview. We've looked at the design moon and then the design and personality Plutos. And the design moon is sort of the inherited emotions, past life emotions, ancestral emotions. And then Pluto is the potential for transformation, both of self and others, through this lens. So next we're going to look at conscious Venus. And I'll just go ahead and actually, let's just get all of the data, so that way I don't have to ask you every time. So Nancy and Pockets, if you can do your personality and design Venus, personality and design Mars, and personality and design Jupiter. So 6 total placements. However you'd like to write that out. You can always just say, Venus and do one / the other, or you can say personality Venus, put that line, design Venus, and so on. So personality and design placements for Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. And I can tell you like some of mine, for instance. I have my body graph handy here, just for convenience. I've mostly memorized it. I never thought I'd memorize it, but now I somehow have. I don't really know how that happened. I have personality Venus and Mars conjunct in gate 29, lines 1 and 4. That's in Leo. I have design Venus and Mars in gate 4 and gate 12. And then I have Jupiter in 9 and 34. Personality 9 and design 34. So yeah, just go ahead and write out your perfect. Thank you, Pockets. Yeah, your Venus and Mars, design and personality. And then that way I'll be able to refer back to this as we do it. And you can always look back up through the chat because I'm typing out the notes as we go, or you can add the key yourself in your notes. Because the keys are really the important part, just kind of as a reminder. Like Nancy, when you're feeling hollow and gambling, focus on that totality and see that that is really the solution. Or, Pockets, when you're feeling disjointed or overly dogmatic, fundamentalist, realizing that conservation is that solution. All right, so I see Pockets has written hers. We can begin, and then Nancy, feel free to join in at any point. So we're going to look at the conscious Venus first. And for the conscious Venus, we're going to, just a second here, I want to make sure that I have the right, I see. We're going to look at all the keynotes here. Yeah, we're just going to look at all of them. Okay. So conscious Venus, Chetan describes this as relating patterns, how you relate with others. What pattern do you bring to your relations? Gate 38. I see, and now Nancy has written these out. Perfect. So we'll just do Pockets, then Nancy for each of these. So Pockets, we're going to look at your gate 38, that gate of the fighter. I have 28, so I know 38 very well. And line 5 there. And remember that the less evolved for line 5 is going to be manipulative, victim or rescuer, things of that nature. And so having a 5th line there, you may have relating patterns. You may have patterns in your relationships with others that do create a false self-image of yourself, or do create triangles of persecutor, savior, victim, and things of that nature. But of course, that is just the low foundational vibe. And then, of course, our whole point here in studying this is so we can see the key that brings together the opposites, that reconciles the opposites and sort of has a redeeming quality. So 38, when we look at it in its low foundational vibes, let me write it out here, 38 low foundational vibes, ping pong between defeatist and aggressive. And yeah, I've seen this quite a bit. I'm a 28, so I have a quite the vantage point, you could say, for seeing that 38. So I have experienced it quite a bit. And it's basically almost like, why do I bother? I'll give up. And then, okay, I'm going to do it. I have to make it happen. I'm going to fight for it. And so fighting for it and then being defeated and then fighting for it and being defeated and this ping-ponging back and forth. And then with that fifth line there, sort of the potential for the false image, the potential for an impractical, larger-than-life persona that's not really grounded in the practicality that the fifth line has as its potential. And this is the relating pattern. So this would be how you consciously relate and how you sort of, how you've come into this life equipped to relate to others. And there's a key here. So the 38 key, which is going to be the key to resolving this, is perseverance. And so it's realizing that, I guess by continuing on, it will be resolved. It's like the defeatist isn't persevering enough, but neither is the aggressive. The aggressive is almost like also not persevering. It's also sort of a way out to avoid persevering. There's a quote that I really like. I have a friend here in Santa Fe, Henry Herman, and he's a really interesting guy. He was a paratrooper. He actually was involved in like, he fought against Noriega and rescued a bunch of people and stuff like that back in the 80s. Really, he's like a real life hero, not just for that, but for many reasons. And really interesting guy, and he's also really brilliant inventor and all this stuff. And he has a favorite quote. I mean, he probably has it emblazoned on a wall somewhere, which is, "A hero is someone who is standing 1 minute longer." It's like, it's a burning building and you're there just 1 minute longer. That's all it takes. But everybody else has fled and you're still there because you're rescuing people from the burning building, But it's just 1 minute. It's not like you don't have to be there the rest of your life. You don't have to live in the burning building. You just have to stay 1 minute longer. That's a real hero. And this guy is a hero. Like, it takes one to know one. I mean, that's sort of what he realized. It's almost like, you're afraid of something, and it's not that you have to face your fear forever. You just have to face your fear for 1 more minute. It's that perseverance of just waiting a tiny little bit of time longer. And then what do you get? What is the 38 high vibe? Is honor. But if you're trying to get the honor, it's going to be ping-ponging between the defeatist and the aggressive. And it's only when you tap into the perseverance that ultimately the honor comes. And then you get the high vibe of that fifth line as well, which we had some of the evolved keynotes of the fifth line. I mean, they're things you already know. It's leadership, practicality, love of humanity, right? Very collective line. Appreciation of expansive concepts, that you have expansive concepts that are then appreciated because you're able to bring them to people in a practical way. Ra had very expansive concepts. And he was able to actually get them appreciated by people, which they're not appreciated by people if they're constantly trapped in that lower frequency. Okay, so that's the 38.5. So let's look at Nancy. This is her patterns of relating, are 17.1. Well, very meta. 17 already has so much to do with patterns, right? But 17.1. And yeah, I see you noted that the detriment there. Yeah, I'm not going to even, I don't know how to add the exaltation detriment analysis here. I'm sure there's a way. I'm sure there's a way to incorporate that. Maybe that's to be saved for further study. But the 17 as conscious relating patterns, the 17, sorry, I'm going to turn this off so it stops doing that. There we go. Okay, so the 17 in its low foundational vibes is going to go between self-critical and opinionated. So the self-critical and then I guess the other critical, or having, I mean, we know 17 gate of opinions, but then also turning that criticism towards self and ping-ponging between being opinionated and self-critical. And then being a first line, as we already saw, some of the first line less evolved keynotes were sensitivity to basically insecurity, being uncomfortable with fears, uncomfortable with confrontation, either repressed or reactive, can be survival issues, secretive, contracting, not comfortable with touch, not very tactile, right? Hiding. And so those are some of the keynotes kind of painting a picture of the first line in its constricted form. But then we see that there's a key, of course. So the key to 17 is farsightedness. So farsightedness, I guess, is the solution both to self-criticality and being overly opinionated. That neither of those, that they're both nearsighted. Neither of those are farsighted enough. Or the other way of looking at it is that they both are potentially farsighted. That self-criticality is a form of farsightedness. It just needs to be encouraged and supported, just like having opinions is a form of farsightedness. So it's interesting that the key can kind of be interpreted in two different ways. The key can be interpreted as the solution to the two problems bouncing back and forth, or the ultimate expression of those two things, right? That those two things are trying to get at this, and that they're able to kind of achieve it through focusing on what their shared goal is. What is the shared commonality between self-criticism and being opinionated? So, that's kind of an interesting, there's alternate readings of what the key is. Either the key is the solution to the two low vibe, foundational vibes, or the key is the ultimate development of the low foundational vibes when they're brought together in union. That together, being self-critical and opinionated and not allowing yourself to escape from self-criticism into being opinionated, or not allowing yourself to escape from being opinionated into self-criticism, somehow holds together these opposites in a conjunctio that merges them into farsightedness. So it's a good question of how we understand that key. Is the key the solution to it, or is the key the ultimate outcome of it? And where does farsightedness lead? To omniscience. So it's funny, there's almost a baked-in gift or baked-in irony of, there's like a baked-in gift and trap at the same time. This is the irony. Trying to get to omniscience through being self-critical and opinionated will never reach it. But somehow by holding the opposites there, one can achieve farsightedness, which then leads to omniscience. So it's like there's a real complexity there. And I think that's why these are so beautiful, these keynotes. They really remind me of R.D. Laing. I don't know if anyone's read R.D. Laing, the anti-psychiatrist, Ronald David Laing. He, let me just show as an example. I'll share a little bit of R.D. Laing here. Let's see if we can find an excerpt. It really reminds me of this. Let's see if I can find the first. Here we go. He's written quite a lot. Well, I don't know about a lot, but quite profound works. Let me see if I can find. Okay, here we go. Perfect. So this is April 1969. R.D. Laing, the anti-psychiatrist. For those who were at HDHD, Layla Ghazal did a talk which was on psychiatry and human design, and she's a clinical researcher, did her master's in psychedelic studies and psychedelic psychotherapy, and very anti-psychiatric in the sense of against over-diagnosing and over-medicating and over-prescribing and things of that nature. And that was a very similar approach to the approach of R.D. Laing. So this is what I'm just kind of reminded of as we're doing, as we're looking at how the low foundational vibes ping-pong back and forth, and then they have a key that somehow resolves them that then leads to the high vibe. R.D. Laing. They are playing a game. They are playing at not playing a game. If I show them I see they are, I shall break the rules and they will punish me. I must play their game of not seeing I see the game. They are not having fun. I can't have fun if they don't. If I get them to have fun, then I can have fun with them. Getting them to have fun is not fun. It is hard work. So that's just one example of how beautiful this prose is, Yeah. I mean, it's like poetry, right? This is like anti-psychiatric prose poetry. Pretty incredible stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's like logical. It's like, this is knots, right? This is logic. Um, there must be something the matter with him. Oh, he thinks there must be something the matter with us for trying to help him to see that there must be something the matter with him. To think that there is something the matter with us for trying to help him to see that we are helping him. To see that we are not persecuting him by helping him. To see we are not persecuting him by helping him. To see that he is refusing to see that there is something the matter with him. For not seeing there is something the matter with him. For not being grateful to us. For at least trying to help him to see that there is something the matter with him. Yeah, it's quite the prose poem. This, you know, it's a great book. It's a great book. Okay, yeah, Nancy says, wow. Oh, she's putting a couple of quotes, yeah. I am possessing it by letting it possess me. I am pushing it by letting it pulling me. Yeah. It's very similar to Maurice Blanchot. I don't know if anyone's familiar with like Maurice Blanchot, The Infinite Conversation, or I love his work. He also wrote The Madness of the Day, La Folie du Jour, about his own experience in a mental asylum after World War II, where he was, in World War II, he was taken to be shot, and he was put up against a wall, and then the guns didn't go off, and, you know, that can be quite a shattering experience itself. But Infinite Conversation is one of his master works, as well as La Folie du Jour, and he's done so many great ones. What did he do? He did Death Sentence is really good. L'Arrêt de Mort. Here's a few quotes just from... There we are, preserved from legitimacy, and speaking unjustifiably. We speak there the way we wait, and their speech is spared significance, just as waiting is when, having distractedly missed our chance to wait, we just have to wait. He's a great writer. Yeah, but very similar to this, right? It's like these are the writers, these are the thinkers that are really getting at some of the complexities, which I think we run into when we see like the low foundational vibe, and then how that can be resolved. But it's almost like, how is it resolved? I mean, these are some of the mysteries of language. Is it that the low foundational vibe represents polarities that must be rejected and overcome or transcended, or are they synthesized, or are they fully embraced? Are they held together at the same time? I mean, these are some of the interesting questions. So it's kind of like deconstruction as well. I'm trying to find a good one. Something in the question necessarily exceeds the power of questioning. But this does not mean there are too many secrets in the world that provoke questions. It is rather the contrary. When being is finally without question, when the whole becomes socially or institutionally realized, at that time and in an unbearable manner, the excess of questioning with respect to the power of questioning will make itself felt for the bearer of the question. The question will be felt as the impossibility of questioning. In the profound question, impossibility questions. So I love that impossibility itself is asking the question, you know. So these are the kind of things we get to. I mean, they're not just language games. They sound a little bit like, you know, some dilettante, you know, language game or something, but it's not. It actually is. It is the play of surfaces, but hidden in the play of surfaces are some deep truths. So, okay, well, let's continue on with that. I just thought that would be a nice little aside to sort of look at some other thinkers who have explored, I guess what the Greeks called aporia, the aporetic core of things. And yeah, R.D. Laing and Maurice Blanchot, absolutely Lasita. And if I had to add one more name to that, and I'll share the link here, it would be Jacques Derrida, who people claim is impenetrable and claim is very hard to get into. But I actually find him delightful, and I wouldn't let anyone reject or dismiss his work. Let me just paste in a couple of... he has a whole section on possible and impossible aporias, and there's that word that I just mentioned, aporia, meaning, well, I guess it's Greek for puzzle, but it's something like, yeah, more like a paradox. The aporetic core. And that's where we get to when we get into some of these keynotes. And we even find this in human design. I mean, much of Ra's thinking results in these aporetic impasses that nevertheless do something to you. You know, they do, like when Ra says, all questioning is ultimately seeking the question whose only answer is silence. That's kind of an aporia. Or the idea of the Zen koan, you know, what is the sound of one hand clapping and things like that. These are sort of meant to produce that effect whereby there's a spontaneous transcendence of the opposites or union of the opposites such that one is seen within the other. And so, yeah, I highly recommend reading this entry on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's also a good entry on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy website. But yeah, Derrida's definitely one of the masters of the aporia. And so I won't paste them in, but he gives all sorts of wonderful puzzles, such as, in order to be hospitable, I can't prevent people from coming, but if I allow someone to come in who takes over and is then inhospitable to others, you know, it's kind of like I'm tolerant of those who are tolerant, but then can I be tolerant of those who are intolerant? Or, you know, the gift that is known is a calculated gift that makes me get a reward, and the true gift has no reward. But if I know I've given a gift and others know I've given a gift, then I get a reward through the social cachet of the sort of social virtue signaling and all of that stuff. And so the true gift is a gift you don't even know it was given, and the receiver doesn't know they've received it. And so you get into these really interesting places where it's like the real gift is like the invisible gift that we don't even know we've given. Really beautiful stuff. So, okay, well, let's return. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So we've looked at 38 and 17. These are the conscious Venus patterns of relating. I'm now going to, hold on a second here. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. We'll look at the conscious Mars, which is personal defense. So, yeah, let me just see. Okay, perfect. So looking at conscious Mars, Pocket says this in 64, line 6. That's actually my conscious Mercury. That's right at 15 degrees Virgo. And that's funny, your Mars is conjunct my Mercury, Pockets. But yeah, 64.6. And then for Nancy, this is 25.6. Yeah, I have 25.5, so some in the neighborhood there. So let's look at gate 64. And so this is personal defense. This is how we are defensive against others. If somebody tries to impinge on our boundaries, if somebody crosses us, crosses our boundaries, things like that. How do we handle that? And the low foundational vibes are going to ping back and forth between imitating and confused. And as the sixth line there, and I mean, I have this as well. It's my Mercury, so I mean, that's probably more how I communicate, right? I either imitate people that I like or I'm confused. At least the sixth line is triumph, the assurance of victory, right? So we at least have some idea that it's okay people are confused because the truth will come out. One of my favorite quotes, a very 64.6 quote from St. Augustine. The truth is a lion. You do not have to defend it. It can defend itself. And that's a very 64.6 idea. The triumph is inevitable. We don't have to go out of our way to clear up confusion. All will become clear on its own. It's a very comforting thought. And so the less evolved form of the sixth line is very separated, detached, aloof, distrusting, head on legs. That was one of the terms that Chetan Parkin used for the sixth line. And so this aloof, imitating, confused, pinging back and forth between trying to do what others do, because maybe that will alleviate the confusion, then just going back to confusion. I love also that gate 64 is in the quarter of duality, and then it has the Godhead of duality, and then it's like, because it's the same diagram 3 times, it's sort of the duality within the Godhead of duality within the quarter of duality. So it's the most fully expressive of duality. And what is its term? What is its name? Confusion. So all duality brings confusion. And even the etymology of the term confusion, con meaning with, and fusion, the merging, the combining. So the two things merged together. The withness of confusion. Anytime we're in relationship, anytime we're in duality, anytime we're bonding with someone else, what is the ultimate expression of bonding? Confusion, the conjoining of two disparate people together, so it's hard to tell where you end and where they begin. And this is why we sleep alone. So to try to avoid a little bit of that confusion. But it's impossible, no matter how much we sleep alone or no matter how clear we are of our own boundaries and so on, there is a merging with the other human where as soon as you get into duality, it's a hall of mirrors. As soon as you're in duality, you're immediately experiencing parallels. You know, I was in a relationship a couple of years ago that ended, and there was a bit of a love triangle. I always try to avoid the love triangle, but she met someone else, and you know, she's a fourth line. They got to be friends, and then they eventually were good friends, and then she broke it off with him. But I said, well, you've been crying for the past week. I mean, you probably shouldn't break it off. You should probably see where it goes. Now they're married, you know, and I have 25, so I do feel like I was at least in my integrity in remaining firm in my belief, which I still believe that it was right for her to pursue that, as painful as it was for me. But, you know, that's the duality where then more recently I began to enter into a relationship with a fourth line who was in a partnership. And I got to experience what it was like to be her friend while she was in a relationship that was ending and to experience it from the other side. And it's very hard to hold on to victim, persecutor, savior beliefs when you've seen each side of it, right? And that's what duality does, is it puts you in those positions where you're no longer able to have a one-sided view of things. The one-sided view, I'm the victim and she's the savior and he's the persecutor, or from her side, you know, he's the savior and I'm the persecutor and she's the victim, or however it goes, any of those games become impossible the more you remain open to duality. So I really do believe duality is the sort of cure for one-sidedness, because it forces you, if you remain open to it long enough, to experience both sides of something. And so as much as we can kind of shake our fist at duality and say, oh, it's so confusing and we're having so many problems because of this, it is ultimately, the real problem is closing ourselves off to bonding. The real problem is becoming isolated. The real problem is refusing to have relationship. Then we really are one-sided. But as long as you're in a relationship, you're going to eventually have this game of musical chairs where you get to sit in each position around the table and experience from that perspective. Okay, so yeah, looking at 64.6, looking at the low foundational vibe, this is the defense mechanism, right? This is the personality Mars. So how do you defend yourself? What is the pattern for the defense? The personal defense is to be aloof, is to be distant, is to be removed. It's the sixth line. It's to be disaffected. And then what is the key in that ping-ponging between imitating and confused? The key is that the 64 possesses within it great imagination, this imaging ability. I love James Hillman in his work on the imaginal. He refused to use the term imaginary because imaginary has all of this baggage where we think of the imaginary as something that's not real. But the imaginal is sort of, you close your eyes and you see it and you open them and they're gone. And then you close your eyes and it's still there. I remember I had a lucid dream once where I was in a record shop and it had hundreds of tapes, cassette tapes and vinyl records. And I took one and I put it in and I played it and listened and it was a song, you know, and I took another one and I remember it was another song. And I remember thinking, who made all this music? That's the imaginal, you know, that's the imaginal. It's this other realm that somehow exists without us that we sometimes tap into. And it's different than the imaginary because the imaginary implies that we've created it, we've imagined it. It's kind of like when James Hillman, his critique of dream analysis is always that we imagine ourselves as the figure seeing from our perspective in the dream. So if we imagine a clown, we imagine that we ourselves have gone into a dream and experienced a clown. But he said, but what if in the dream we're actually seeing the ego, we're seeing ourselves from the perspective of the unconscious? What if the ego is the clown? What if we're actually getting to see ourselves from the other point of view? So it's the same kind of idea, that there's an imaginal realm that does have validity, that does have veracity, that is important, that can't just be dismissed as only your imagination. It is the imagination, but the imagination is a key. And what does it lead to? Illumination. So ultimately, through imagination, you can transcend the ping-ponging of imitation and confusion and achieve illumination. And this is your ultimate personal defense. This is how you navigate people encroaching on your boundaries. And this is the potential to really reach an embodied way of defending yourself. Because we all have to defend ourselves. But are we going to do it in a less evolved way of being separated and distrustful? Or are we going to do it through enjoying being in the body, letting go, looking for what's real and authentic, and guiding others? These are some of the potentials for the sixth line. And then for Nancy, this conscious Mars here. So her conscious Mars, Nancy, your conscious Mars is in gate 25, line 6. So the similar sixth line keynotes we talked about, the defense through aloofness, the defense through being disaffected, the potential to achieve a defense that is actually based on loving being in the body, and defending yourself and being untouchable because of how much you enjoy being in the body, because of how much you've let go, because of how much you're in your authenticity, because of how much you can guide others. So they come to you and encroach on your boundaries, and you guide them and send them in a different direction instead of just being aloof and distant and disaffected. And then seeing that it's gate 25. So 25 has low foundational vibes of ignorant and cold. So going between ignoring and being cold. So this, you can really see how with this aloofness, it's sort of like, I'm going to defend myself, you've encroached on my boundaries, you've overstepped the boundaries, I'm going to ignore you. Or, you won't let me ignore you? Okay, then I'm going to be cold. I will pay attention to you, but I'm going to send you an ice ray. And this ice ray, it can be very aloof and very distant. It's the sixth line there. It can be very nice. There's a term in Seattle. They say people in Seattle are nicey. They're very nice and they're very icy. And so that's a way of basically ignoring or being cold. Ignoring, being cold. And what is the key of 25? How do we get through this ping-ponging of ignoring and being cold? Through acceptance. So you don't have to be cold to others when you've accepted them. When somebody's tripped your tripwire and your personal defenses go into high gear, you have this key now of acceptance, which is going to solve the ping-ponging between being ignorant and cold, and it's going to help you be less aloof and less of a head on shoulders and more enjoying in your body, enjoying being embodied, being a guide for others. One of the things Chetan Parkin talks about for the sixth line is the need for soul retrieval. And I never really thought much about this. I've heard of it, but apparently this is sort of a sixth line thing, this being so detached and so aloof that they've become disconnected from their own soul. And so the soul retrieval becomes more embodied. And we talk a lot about embodiment in human design. I think it's probably very important for the sixth line, even more than some of the others. Yeah. Enjoying being in the body, letting go, looking for what's real and authentic. Some of the potential. And then ultimately reaching the high vibe of gate 25, which is universal love. This is a keynote that should be very familiar to us from Ra's work. That there's no need to ignore and there's no need to maintain coldness. when you really accept. And that acceptance can lead to universal love. And this is ultimately the best defense for you, that you can actually use that universal love as a defense. That someone oversteps a boundary or someone tries to take from you or confronts you in a way that requires a defense, and that you have universal love there as a way to disarm them. I mean, what's more disarming than love, right? Okay, now we look at the unconscious Venus. And this is instilled love. I'll give some of the keynotes as well. Unconscious Venus is instilled love. I haven't been writing some of the other keynotes down. Conscious Venus is relating patterns. Conscious Mars equals personal defense. So this unconscious Venus, this is instilled love. This is love from family of origin and ancestors and maybe even past lives. This is really a very powerful key, something that Chetan Parkin told me personally before I'd ever attended any of his workshops or anything. We just had a conversation, and he told me, because I talked to him about love gates and being a cross of healing and the healing power of love and various things. We ended up talking about past lives and connection to all of this stuff. And he said, well, you know, Jonah, love comes in on a very narrow line. It's like, was it Rumi, or maybe it was, I think it was Rumi. It's like, the crack is where the love gets in. The crack is where the light gets in, you know, that kind of idea. And he said there's this very, very narrow place in the whole body graph that the love gets in, and it's the line of the unconscious Venus. And that's where we're sort of receiving the love of our ancestors, all the love that's been poured into our creation, because, hey, we wouldn't be here if there wasn't for love. There had to at least be enough love for mating to occur, for pregnancy to occur. You know, there had to be some amount of love. And it goes all the way back. We wouldn't be here if our parents weren't the product of some form of love, and if their parents weren't the product of some form of love, and so on. So there is this unbroken chain of love being poured into us from our ancestors as well as our past lives, and this is the unconscious Venus, the design Venus. And the instilled love. So for pockets, we see this as gate 18, line 1. For Nancy, gate 10, line 1. So for pockets, I'll just say, I'll write it out here. Pockets, design Venus, 18.1, low foundational vibe of 18 is going to be going between integrity and, integrity, of course. That's the one, sorry, I misread. Inferiority. Integrity is the high vibe. I was going to say, that doesn't sound right at all. Are you telling me that integrity is a sham? I don't think so. I take umbrage with that. I'm a 58, so I love 18s. You know, I'm like a dog chasing around the cats, right? So inferiority and superiority. And this is really a fundamental question for the 18. You know, this is about that criticality that the 18 is notorious for. The judgment the 18 is notorious for is basically ping-ponging between it's not good enough or it's better than. It's inferior or it's superior. The inferiority complex, the superiority complex. This is a better way of doing it than that, and this is not a good enough way. It's not, you know, Ra always joked for the 18, never tell them how good their food is, because they'll find something wrong with it. And I forget this sometimes. We have, Krista comes to our Human Design Weekly events, and she always makes this great food. I'm always like, oh my God, this is the best guacamole I've ever had. She's like, well, you know, it could have had a little more salt, and the avocados weren't quite done yet, and I ran out of peppers, and you know, and I'm always like, no, it's amazing. It's fresh guacamole, like, it's really good. But I just need to remind myself not to give the compliment, because it immediately starts the ideation of what could be better. But yeah, this instilled love that can go between inferiority and superiority and comparison and what could be better. And then that first line, the less evolved version of the first line that's trapped in the low foundational vibe, which is afraid of touch, afraid of fear, right? It's one thing to be afraid, But to be afraid of fear is different, right? To be comfortable with fear, that's what we're aiming for. It's like the first line will always have fear. 18 is splenic. There's always going to be fear there. But are you comfortable with that fear? Is there insecurity that causes fear to be repressed or fear to be reactive? Versus the comfort with the fear that's so healing, that's saying, oh, I'm scared as hell of that, and that's okay. Doesn't have to be repressed. And so that less evolved first line, that the fear of confrontation, secretive, hiding, and so on. And pinging between inferiority and superiority, and then the key of 18, this is what I misread earlier, it's 18 key, is integrity. So it's so interesting, inferiority to integrity, or inferiority, superiority to integrity. Like really the question of having the integrity to be trustworthy when it comes to standing up for, really, I think that's also first line, especially for the 18.1 here. Standing up for what's right in terms of this is an improvement. I am in my integrity in this judgment, but it's almost like judgment without judgment. It's like judgment that is up from a place of integrity, so it's not just saying, well, I could do it better, or that wasn't good enough. It's almost like judgment without comparison. It's like saying, like, the judgment is that there is a solution that may improve, and yet we're not saying that solution is better than what happened, because what happened is what happened. I've seen this. We've had, just a couple years ago at HDHD, there was someone with the 1858 splenic projector, splenic ego projector, 4426, 1858. And a big question came up around integrity, and I've always found them to be a person of integrity, but there was a sort of problem of just falling into better than, should have been, could have been, not good enough language. And I think in our conversations we did really explore moving into the realms of the inferiority superiority battle, and then moving back to the place of integrity, which is really saying at the end of the day, it's not about putting down the thing is not being good enough, and it's not about presenting oneself as superior. It is ultimately about having the integrity to remain true to your judgments. So you're not giving up your judgments. You're just not allowing your judgments to fall into one-sidedness. And what does that lead to? It leads to perfecting. 18 high vibe is perfecting. And then with the first line here, the first line becomes very comfortable with their fears, comfortable standing up for themselves, becomes very tactile. That was such an interesting keynote from Chetan Parkin, because I am a very tactile person, but I just wasn't, I never associated that with the first line, but I have more first lines than just about anything else except third lines. I have 8 first lines and 9 third lines, and 1 more of each if you count Chiron. Yeah, the first line in its more evolved form becomes a rock for others. That's one of the terms that Chetan Parkin uses. A rock for others. So a rock of integrity. So just remembering that this is going to be an aspect of the instilled love. This is part of the love karma. I mean, my love karma is gate 4, line 1, which is all about knowing when pleasure won't be punished. Knowing when I can actually experience pleasure and not, and for me it has to do with, I can be very apathetic and very intolerant of people, and I have to learn forgiveness ultimately. That's been a huge, huge lesson for me of letting the love into my life and experiencing my sort of love karma has been coming to a place of understanding that leads to forgiveness. So for you, it's going to be finding that place of integrity that leads to perfecting and overcoming the better, worse comparison game. Because that's all Maya. Maya, the Sanskrit root ma, which means to measure. And then for Nancy, I'll type it out a little bit, just scrolling up here. So Nancy has designed Venus in 10.1, modesty. Design Venus 10-1. Wow, all of us with first line Venuses. 4-1, 18-1, 10-1. And that is gate 10 low foundational vibe is pinging between self-denying and narcissistic. So I guess these are the two sides of self-love. Self-abnegation, I'm not going to love myself, and then narcissism, I'm going to love myself too much. It's like too little self-love, too much self-love. And pinging between the two of those. And in relationships, I mean, such an interesting key to relationships, to this instilled love, how you experience love is like, if the relationship isn't somehow participating in self-love, is it really a relationship? That this is the love karma, that it has to do with self-love. And what an interesting placement for that design Venus. That the relationship is either bringing you to more self-love or not. It's either that your love karma is either teaching you about how to overcome the pinging between too much and too little self-love, or it's not, and then it's not the right relationship for you. So in my case, it's, my relationships are either teaching me how to have understanding and forgiveness, or I'm remaining apathetic and intolerant. That's my lot in life. For me to really experience love in relationships. I mean, this is, as Chetan Parkin said, this is the one line in the whole body graph it gets in. Yes, we have love gates. Yes, we have personality Venus, and we have other activations and so on. But I mean, he was pretty adamant about this design Venus is where the love gets in. And everything is filtered through that. And so for me, it's filtered through the question of apathy and the question of intolerance, or whether I can transcend and overcome that polarity in order to achieve true understanding of the other person. And if I'm able to do that, then I can actually forgive. And so, I've learned more about love through being betrayed than I have through a very easy, so-called easy relationship, right? Because an easy relationship isn't challenging me, but a relationship that involves betrayal and cheating and things like that is really challenging me to understand and to not misunderstand, because if I misunderstand, I remain apathetic and intolerant. And if I can actually truly understand, then I can forgive. But there's no forgiveness without understanding. And that's sort of my movement through relationships in this life. So for Nancy, this is going to be going between the too much and the too little of the self-love, and being brought to yourself through relationships, that the relationship will either give you deeper access to yourself or not. And if it gives you deeper access to yourself, it's going to give you a way forward to overcome the self-abnegating, self-denying, ping-ponging with the narcissistic self-absorption. And that's going to happen through the key of 10, which is naturalness. So that's going to be a big key for you. And just holding on to these keys, like realizing that these keys really are the solution to a seemingly intractable problem. And that this key also, because it's a first line, is going to help you. I mean, it's not just naturalness there. It's going to help you be comfortable with your fears. It's going to help you be more solid and stable as a rock for people. It's going to help you stand up for yourself. It's going to help you be more comfortable with touch and tactile. And that's something so interesting. I mean, if I thought of first line, I would think almost continuity to smell or something. But it is tribal. It is fundamentally tribal. And so there is some relationship to touch there. And through that key of naturalness, it will ultimately bring you to the high vibe of being. So that the ultimate achievement is to actually be. It's almost like a Pinocchio story, actually being a real person, not just a concept, not just an attempt, but actually achieving being. But you can't achieve being without that naturalness, and living in a state of self-denying is certainly not being, and living in a state of self-absorption is also not being. And living in a constricted state of secrecy and hiding and all of those, fear of fear, those first line themes, that's not being. But when you're actually fully accepting of your fears and comfortable with fears and able to reach that place of naturalness, which I think from what I know of you, you pretty much live there all the time. Then you get to live in that trueness of being. Okay, maybe we'll do one more and then take a little break, and then I'm happy going all the way for another hour and 10 minutes if folks are still hanging in there. This is pretty deep work, so maybe I should have had some warnings at the beginning that we're going to go to some deep places here. I don't know if you've been experiencing that, but when I look at these words, oh, thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I experience these words take me places. These words are like mantras. The mantra is the name of the God, or the phone number for the God that calls the God in. But these words are also like mantras. These words carry us somewhere, almost like the concept of the Merkaba, or the spiritual vessel that takes you somewhere. These words transport. That's the power in the words, that they're actually able to transport us somewhere. So we'll look at one more and then take another short break, and then we'll come back and kind of go through it. And this will be a good place to take a break after this one, because this is sort of the lowest of the low point. This is the sort of dark night of the soul. I really like how Chetan Parkin has structured this, because he first looks at the ancestral karma, the design moon, the Plutos. Then he gets into love, to our relating patterns, our personal defenses, and then the instilled love. And then we get to this very dark place, which in Gene Keys is called the core wound, the design Mars. And for Chetan Parkin, he gives this the keynote of abandonment. He puts it in quotes, so I'll do it the way he does as well, because I guess I could have many, many versions of being abandoned. But this is the wound. He also calls it the wound. And so this is a very deep place for us, where he did say, if there's one key that you need to always have with you, it's the key to your design Mars, because that's a key. He also Saturn. He looks at Saturn later. That's a big one. But the key to the design Mars is just so important, because you can be in these places in life where you feel the true depth of abandonment and not know where to turn and not know where to look. And when you look at that key, it's like the key is already in your hand. You already have this key, and that gives you the way to unlock the energy from being constricted and trapped. And this comes up so much. I mean, at the HDHD conference, we had 158 attendees. It was so wonderful. And the first couple of days were very difficult for me, because our AV person essentially quit the day before the event. And then on the first day of the event, I ended up removing everything he'd done and rewiring everything myself and doing the whole stream myself. And it was quite a disaster, because he'd effectively abandoned the project. So I felt a lot of abandonment there. I do think abandonment is the core wound, because there's many ways to abandon. And one is somebody quitting the day before the event, right? And then because I was so preoccupied with that, I was working till 4 a.m. every night. And so then I didn't really get in sync with the people I'm usually in sync with. So I didn't really form any pentas. So by Saturday night, there was a party I wanted to go to after our evening event, and I invited a bunch of my friends to it. And they all left without me. About 15 people left, and nobody brought me, even though I said I'd like to go. But there were, the pentas were full. The pentas were already formed. I mean, it's not personal. It's that if there's a 5-person penta and they've all been hanging out for 3 days, they're all going to go to the event together. So I was completely alone. And then I ended up having a few friends staying at my house, but they were all coupling. I mean, I think 3 or 4 couples formed by that Saturday night. So there's all these, which is also obnoxious to me for other reasons. I really believe the Gate 19 wisdom that, don't mix single and coupled people in the same household. It'll cause a lot of strife. But basically I was in a state where after DJing and the party had winded down, I wanted to go to this other party, but the 15 people I'd invited had all left without me. And then the people that were still at my house were all behind locked doors having sex. So, which was really obnoxious. I mean, I definitely don't want people to stay here in the future. I realized it happens every year, and to me it's very obnoxious. Like I'm not puritanical, but I am, I don't think of HDHD as a way to have that kind of experience. At the same time, there are HDHD success stories of people who fall in love, who met at the conference, and who've had beautiful, beautiful relationships. I'm not certain that Richard and Brandy met at the conference, but I know that that's possibly one of the success stories, and there have been others. So obviously, I'm not some Puritan who's going to try to prevent people from bonding, although I wish they wouldn't do it at my house. But in any case, it resulted in a basically, it was the end of the night, and I'd finally, after days and days and days of work, gotten to a point where I was actually free. I was actually free to enjoy, and yet there was nobody to enjoy with. And so it was complete abandonment. I mean, all of my friends had left. The people at my house were all isolated and had locked doors and were in private, and I was pretty much all alone in my house. And it was a moment of just realizing that abandonment happens all the time, and you can be abandoned surrounded by people, and that's just a fact of life. It's nothing personal. It's the flow of life, that life will take you to places of isolation and alienation and places where you're all alone. And it's funny because on most days people would be like, oh, Jonah, you have time? I want to talk with you. But it's like the timing, right? Everyone wants to talk, and then they're all gone, and you're all alone. And so I ended up actually, I just spent a couple hours by myself just relaxing and enjoying, and I actually ended up experiencing it more as a gift. But there was a bit of a disappointment because at first, because I'd looked forward to being able to actually celebrate with my friends. And that's when abandonment strikes. There's a quote from the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan that enthusiasm and melancholy are two sides of the blade, and that the more enthusiastic you are about something, the more melancholy can strike. And that all of my enthusiasm and excitement for the event and everything, well, hey, even in the midst of 150 attendees and everyone hanging out, there can be a melancholic moment where suddenly everyone leaves. So there's no blame, there's no problem there. I mean, I actually ended up feeling very refreshed the next day, but I was surprised. I was even maybe a little shocked because I'd planned to finish all my duties for the evening and then get to hang out with friends and enjoy and celebrate, and then I ended up completely alone. And it was just a kind of a reminder that abandonment is always there, that there's no escaping it, there's no avoiding it. No amount of people around are going to prevent abandonment. No amount of activity or anything like that is going to prevent abandonment. And so, in my case, I have 12.6 there. My design Mars is 12.6. So I go into a lot of elitism, and it can essentially be very judgmental of others in its own way. Between elitism and malice, and I could easily have ping-ponged in that night. Like the elitism of, I'm so much better than them, or the malice of, I want them to not enjoy their night. And I am thankful that I was able to sort of go into the key without necessarily knowing it. My key is discrimination, and realizing that in my discrimination, I can see that I didn't really need to go to that other party, and I didn't really want to spend time with those people who were busy coupling in their own ways, and it was okay, and then getting to the high vibe of that is purity. So getting to experience, wow, I did have a very pure Saturday night. I've had some Saturday nights of the conference, basically the peak of the conference, doing shots of tequila and, dancing and laughing until the wee hours of the morning. And this was a much more pure, discriminating, sort of reflective, and maybe even a little bit melancholic, but that's okay. I had so much fun other times during the event, and there were so many other amazing experiences. I would never trade it for anything. And it's kind of like people who go to Burning Man expecting it to be a big party, and they end up spending 3 days wandering in the desert by themselves in a deep melancholy and go, what happened? And it's like, well, that's your experience. You don't get to choose what the experience brings you. Or doing plant medicine, you don't get to choose that experience. Sometimes you go to a very unusual place, and maintaining, in my case anyway, the purity of intention is sort of, I was able to wake up the next day feeling very refreshed and very, very pure. I did feel pure the next day. I didn't feel burdened by anger or disappointment or any of that. I was sort of able to let that go. Okay, so let's look at the abandonment keys, the core wound keys for Pockets and Nancy, and we'll take a short break. So for Pockets, we have design Mars, and this is core wound or abandonment. Abandonment. And that is in 62.3. And for Nancy, the design Mars is 60, line 2. So for pockets, this gate 62, this core wound, and how is, what happens when that's triggered? It's like we looked at the personality Mars. That's like your conscious defense mechanism is triggered. Somebody overrides your boundaries, somebody, pushes you, somebody attacks you, something like that. How does your defense flare up? But this is the design Mars. I mean, this is different. This is very deep. It's not just somebody confronting you or in a hostile way or attacking you. This is, like I was saying at the event, I mean, there can be 150 people around, you can still be abandoned. And this is the abandonment of truly being left in isolation, and however form that takes. And then what does the foundational low vibe frequency set in? For me, it's the elitism and the malice. And sort of the lower vibe for me would be, I don't need them anyway, or they should be punished, they shouldn't be having so much fun without me, or however that looks, right? Some sort of low vibe expression of that. So for 62, I'll just say 62 low foundational vibe, that is going to be obsessive and pedantic. So going between the obsessive and the pedantic, this is, this is the other side of 17, right? So this is, you have the opinions, this is the details side. This is, either obsessing over the details or being very pedantic about the details. And so during that point of abandonment where that deep core wound is triggered, there's going to be this pinging between hyper focus on details that don't matter or hyper obsession about what it should be, or, this is going to be the two sides. And that, I see you're saying, yep, yeah. Or actually you said, yep. Maybe just for a breath of fresh air, I'll tell you, Mike has one joke and one joke only. And I always ask him to tell jokes, and he only knows one joke. And his joke is, what do you call a three-eyed fish? Fish. So anyway. Okay. Little linguistic joke there. So this 62, I mean, this is like more than just personality Mars triggered. It's more than just somebody impinging on your boundaries or confronting you in a hostile way. This is like the deep core wound of abandonment, and that can send into a spiral of obsessive pedantic. And because it's line 3, there can be a lot of shame there, and there can be greed there, and wanting so much more than there is. There can be avoidance. It can feel like it's never good enough. It can feel non-committal. And so these are some of the less evolved forms of the third line. And then we look at the 62 key, and this is going to be one of the most important keys that you get. I mean, this is one of the most important keys. This is a key that can really stop the tailspin, stop the ping pong. This can be a key that can really cure that feeling of abandonment. And it's the key of precision. And so it's really realizing that all of that obsession and all of that being pedantic for the details and all of that is really a form of being precise. And if you can dial in that precision, then you don't have to worry about being so obsessed about it. You don't have to worry about being so pedantic about it. You're really getting to a place where you're very precise, where you're saying exactly what it is, you're understanding exactly what it is. You're not just blanket statementing it. You're not just allowing it to be some, you're realizing that you actually have a real gift here, that the gift is to be very precise. And then from that precision, you can get to the more evolved forms of the third line, learning quickly from mistakes, being all in life. You can put yourself fully into things, finding humor and being adaptable and realizing that you actually have this power of adaptation and this power of being able to laugh at things, and this power of being able to learn quickly and not make the same mistake again and fully put yourself into it. But that's when you get there through understanding how powerful that precision is. And ultimately, the high vibe of 62 is impeccability. You become impeccable. Yeah, impeccability. And so this is really just like how I experienced the abandonment and the wounding and then found a place of purity. Ultimately, you can be in that same state of abandonment and wounding. You can get to a place of impeccability, and you get there through precision. And these are mysterious keynotes. I mean, what is that going to look like for you? I mean, in that state where you're maybe feeling deeply wounded and heart hurt, heartbroken even, and things like that, and experiencing that heartbreak, how does precision heal that heartbreak? That's going to be something for you to discover, because again, these words can take us in a lot of different directions, but ultimately they are mysterious. I mean, this is a mysterious thing that you're going to realize. Like if somebody told me, Jonah, the cure for your spiraling in elitism and malice is discrimination, I would kind of say, huh? Discrimination? How does that work, right? But it takes me to a place of purity, because when I'm actually discriminating, then I'm actually noticing I don't just want indiscriminate connection, right? I actually, when I am feeling that place of abandonment, maybe even jealousy that others are having so much connection and I've been left, the discrimination reminds me that I actually don't want the kind of connection they're having. It's not like I wish I were in their shoes. I can actually be happy for them that they are in their shoes and that I'm in my shoes. I can actually, through discrimination, appreciate that, and that can lead me to a place of purity where I can appreciate that I've remained in the pureness of what it is to be me, of who I am, and not allowed myself to be polluted by trying to be someone else. But these keynotes are not always apparent. Precision to impeccability is not, this is going to be something that you're going to, I'm glad you have the Gene Keys book too, because you can kind of see how Richard Rudd describes these keynotes too, because there's a lot in them. There's a lot compressed. These are highly compressed keynotes, just as we find with Ra. And then Nancy, we have Your Design Mars in gate 60, line 2. So we have the second line, themes of unaware, oblivious, angry, things of that nature. And we can see that gate 60 has a low foundational vibe, pinging back and forth between unstructured and rigid. So when you're triggered at this deep level of abandonment and of the core wound, that can throw you into a place where you either become very rigid or you become very unstructured, and sort of the order and the chaos fighting against each other, and wanting to impose limitations, but then wanting to be free of the limitations, being unhappy with them, unsatisfied with them, and kind of pinging between the two of these. And then as line 2, we know that can be oblivious, and that can be, not wanting to look at things and so on. And that is the sort of less evolved version of the second line. So when you're triggered in this deep place, I would even just say, using our traditional human design keynotes, that it gets to a place of limitation, and that ultimate limitation is the bounce between the order and the chaos. It's very much this fundamental battle between rigidity and lack of rigidity, or being unstructured. And how do you resolve that? It's like, things are too unstructured, I better be more rigid. Things are too rigid, I better be more unstructured. I better go to the other side of it. But the whole time can be very angry, very oblivious, very unaware. And how do you get to that evolved second line that's natural, that's relaxed, that's curious, that's playful? How do you reach that playfulness? You can't reach it when you're going between the unstructured and the rigid. And so we look at the key for 60, and its key is realism. So realism realizes that both rigidity and unstructured living are unrealistic. You can't live your life in such a rigid way, and you can't live your life in such an unstructured way. Neither of those are realistic. All those do is remain in a state of obliviousness, of lack of awareness, of anger. And how do you overcome those? How do you reconcile those? Through being realistic. And that realism is going to bring you to a place where you are natural, you are relaxed, you are playful. I think it does already. I see you as a very realistic person, and you're also a very natural, relaxed, playful person, and you are very curious about others. And these are some of the more evolved second line keynotes. But that realism is going to take you there, and ultimately it's going to bring you to the high vibe, which is justice. And so justice will be served, right? What an interesting thing, right? It's almost like you're triggered at a very deep level of the core wound, and the unstructured and the rigid, and the unstructured and the rigid, both as ways of trying to get to justice, but they're too one-sided. They're like one-sided approaches to justice. You're like, we will have justice, we'll be rigid, or we will have justice, we will allow the chips to fall where they may. But either way, it's overly one-sided. It's only the realism that understands sometimes you have to be rigid, sometimes you have to let things happen the way they're going to happen. But that knowing when to be rigid and when to be structured and when to be unstructured, that is the true way to enforce justice in the world, not through trying to make it happen in a one-sided way. So let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the remaining placements. We'll finish up with Venus and Mars, and we'll look at Jupiter. If anyone has any comments, feel free to jump on audio or in the chat. If anyone's feeling fatigued and needs to jump off, I am recording all of this, and I'm happy to continue on Nancy and Pockets both with your placements since you've shared them. So don't feel like you're going to miss out on having your placements examined if you have to jump off for any reason. But of course, if you'd like to stay on, I will be back in about 5 minutes. I'm just going to take a short break, and we'll continue then. Thank you so much, Nancy. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this was one of the very... I've been wanting to do this for a while, actually, since I experienced it. So the Monday after the conference, I guess September 23rd, Chetan went over this, material, and then some. He obviously added his own... he had a number of other guided meditations and techniques he uses and all sorts of things that he added to it. So I don't want to give the impression that this is all that he did, but this was a portion of what he brought and gave to us, and I think it was really profound and certainly touched me deeply, and has been something that I have returned to, even bringing it with me on the post-conference camping trip and so on, to be able to really sit with these keynotes. I really think having these keys is really powerful, just to sort of feel like you have something. It's almost like you have an etheric sword and shield and medallion and the things that you need. It's kind of like having these etheric gifts for triumphing over the adversities that life brings. So I'll be back in just a few moments, maybe like 3 to 5 minutes. All right, so I'd like to just continue. We have about 45 more minutes, and that should be enough to finish up Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, which completes the analysis of love in the body graph, of love karma. And so as I mentioned, this is not exactly what Chetan did. I would call this an investigation of the Karmagraph. What he did was karma clearing, including various practices for actually clearing the karmas there. I'm not doing those. This is simply using some of the keynotes and forms of analysis that he developed. And of course, using the keynotes from Richard Rudd that I was surprised to learn that Chetan had developed with Rudd, or that Rudd brought him the keynotes that he had downloaded, that Rudd had downloaded, but that Chetan had already been working in this area with Rudd, and they'd been developing the need for new keynotes that look at the different expressions of the gates. All right, so we looked at the unconscious Mars, the core wound, the abandonment. So next we're going to return to unconscious Venus. And this is interesting now. So we're returning to unconscious Venus, but now instead of calling it instilled love, Chetan calls it unconscious love. So this is the design Venus. And he did this a few times where he would return to ones we've already looked at, the keynotes, and just ask you to look at the keynotes again now that you've sort of passed through the threshold of the design Mars. So having sort of examined the core wound, now that we go back to the unconscious Venus, can we see it in a different way? And so this is, for pockets, this is going to be 18.1. And for Nancy, this is going to be 10.1. And so we return to the keynotes that we looked at here, and we see pockets, the unconscious love that moves between inferiority and superiority until it finds the key of integrity. And then from integrity leads to perfecting. So this perfecting. That is possible through having integrity and through being able to overcome the bouncing of the better and worse and inferior, superior. And then for Nancy, this was all about self-love, too much, too little. Self-denial, self-abnegation versus narcissism and self-absorption, and how that ping-ponging can really stop when there's the key of naturalness that unites the opposites and brings them together and ultimately achieves being. So we look at those same keynotes again, but now having been through this, it's almost like threading. It's like on our way down we saw them as the instilled love, then we got to the core wound, now we're coming back up, having threaded through that, and now having the key of that core wound, and having that realism for Nancy and that precision for pockets, and now armed with your key, you're kind of now able to return to this unconscious love with a new light, knowing that the realism can help heal any problem that comes along, that the precision can help heal any problem that comes along. And so having a new relationship to the design Venus, not just the relationship of the design Venus as the instilled love, but now this unconscious love. And now we return to the conscious Mars. But the conscious Mars is no longer just personal defense. It's keynoted as defense awareness. And so this defense awareness for pockets, personality Mars, defense awareness is 64.6. And then for Nancy, the defense awareness is in 25.6. And so returning to personality Mars, but no longer seeing it only as this tripwire, the personal defense mechanism that gets tripped, but now that you sort of have the key, in Pocket's case, the key of precision, in Nancy's case, the key of realism, these keys now have a different approach to the personality Mars. So for Pockets, the imitating confused, which then has the key of the imagination, that can now be seen as you can more easily get into the imagination because when you have that core wound of abandonment triggered, you know to be precise. And so that precision allows you access to the imagination. So now you have this defense awareness that's no longer sort of an automatic program. It's the awareness of be precise with your imagination, and you can get to the real gift of 64, which is illumination. And for Nancy, pinging between being basically ignoring and being cold, now that you have this sort of key for the core wound, the key of realism, that key of realism is going to be there for you to to essentially help overcome that pinging of ignoring and cold and ignoring and cold and get to acceptance. The realism is going to help you get to that key of acceptance and to ultimately achieve that disarming quality of universal love, which is really your best defense. The true aware defense, not an automatic defense that's a tripwire, but an aware defense. So you kind of see that now that we're returning to these keynotes we've already looked at, you have this deep key of the unconscious Mars of how to overcome this deepest core wound or core triggers, the core abandonment. And armed with this, it's now more easy to access the keys of your relating patterns and of your personal defense, of your instilled love. So now we return to what we looked at before as relating patterns. This is conscious Venus. Now we call it love awareness. And so this conscious Venus love awareness, let's return to it. So for Pockets, this is 38.5, and for Nancy, this is 17.1. And so now we are returning, again, it's like threading. It's like we started here. We started with relating patterns, then through personal defense, then through instilled love. Then we got the key at the deepest point, that key for the core wound. And now we're going our way back up. And we now look at the unconscious love, the defense awareness, now the love awareness. So we've kind of threaded deep and back up. And so now we're returning to these keynotes. So for Pockets, it's going to be the defeatist and the aggressive, right? Going between defeatist and aggressive and defeatist and aggressive. But now that you know this key of precision, you're able to use the precision to help you persevere. You can persevere more in things and have this love awareness and the need for perseverance in love to overcome the pinging between the aggression and the defeatism. And you can do this because you have this core key of precision. So you have this very deep, very powerful key that's going to help you persevere. And ultimately, of course, that perseverance is going to bring you to honor. So you're going to get to that very honorable place, but it's because you now have this key that anytime you're feeling abandoned, anytime you're having this core wound brought up or injured or hurt, you know how important precision is. And then for Nancy, again, it's that realism. So 17, looking at those keynotes again, this is self-critical and opinionated and self-critical and opinionated. And being very realistic is going to kind of cure that because it's going to allow you to access the key of farsightedness and ultimately become very omniscient. So it really is this way that the key for the core wound of abandonment can help you access the other keys. It can help you because you'll have the other keys more available because, what can happen is we know what keys we need, but then we get triggered into that core wound of abandonment and suddenly we're thrown into this place where we can no longer access those other keys. So that's why the core wound of abandonment is kind of the master key. And that's why we looked at personality Venus, personality Mars, design Venus on our way down. Then we look at design Venus, personality Mars, personality Venus on the way back up. So we kind of had to go deep down into that core wound place to find the master key and then come back up out of it. So I'm just going to take a moment and then we're going to look at a few more. But you can see kind of the practice that we've done here. It really is, the first part is just learning the keynotes, but then the second part is like relearning them almost. We've learned them and then now we're kind of putting them into practice and seeing how through that master key of the core wound, we're able to experience those keynotes we just learned half an hour ago, but now we're experiencing them in a new light. So it's kind of powerful to get to learn them twice like that. Okay, so the next place we're going to look is the unconscious Jupiter. And this is the wealth attitude. And so I'm going to go ahead and share. So Pocket's Design Jupiter is in, let's see, Wealth Attitude is in 48.1. And Nancy's Design Jupiter, which is the Wealth Attitude, is in 38.2. So wealth attitude. This is our attitude towards money, towards abundance, towards the nicer things in life. And this is like Karen Curry Parker, how she, replied, the attitudes are in the body, right? The attitudes are energies that we're born with and that we're sort of connected to. And because it's on the design side, it does relate to our ancestors and it does relate to past lives. Like our unconscious is not only our unconscious, it's an unconscious that connects to consciousness itself, to the consciousness of our ancestors and to our past lives and all of it. So this Design Jupiter is almost like our inherited wealth attitude in some sense. And it is in the body. It is. And we do transform it. Deconditioning does transform our attitudes because they are something physical. It's almost like, Jacques Lacan had a very interesting distinction between projection and introjection. He said projection is at the level of the imaginary. You imagine things about somebody. That's when you're projecting on them. But introjection is at the level of the symbolic, which is different than the imaginary. And introjection is when you've been force-fed certain symbols or signifiers. You've been told you are this. Certain key words people have been told, and they've basically swallowed those words, and those words have become part of their body. And part of the work of psychoanalysis is to dislodge, almost to get the analysand to cough up and spit out, or even purge those signifiers from the body, those signifiers that have been buried deep within the body through force feeding. So it's the same kind of idea here. It's not just a mental thing. Our attitudes are deep within us in a very physical place. And of course, we study this through the body graph as signified by the activations. And that the same activation has a low vibrational frequency, a foundational low vibe, as well as a high vibrational frequency. And so the low vibrational frequency of the wealth attitude of gate 48, 48, the low foundational vibe, and that pings between bland and unscrupulous. So this is going to be the sort of default operating frequency for most of the world who has 48. They're going to be pinging between blandness and lack of scruples. Scruples are sort of like principles, right? Like an unscrupulous merchant would buy stolen goods or something, right? Because they don't have the principles to want to maintain a high standard or something like that. So the 48 low foundational vibe when it comes to wealth would be toggling between being bland and being unscrupulous. And again, this Mars key that we found can help even here. I mean, it is a master key. So being precise can really help here as well. But of course, each of these have their own keys. Also, looking at the line, we see it's the first line. So the low foundational vibe of the wealth attitude here is going to be uncomfortable with fear. And it is going to be secretive and hiding. And what are some of the other keynotes we had here? Contracting, survival issues, a sort of survivalist wealth attitude. Repressing fears or reacting to fears out of insecurity. Afraid of confronting. I mean, these are some of the kind of wealth karma, the wealth attitude karmas that anyone with the first line design Jupiter is going to deal with. So when it comes to money, when it comes to abundance in life, when it comes to having wealth in life, there's going to be a sort of default operating script of, or a belief system even, that toggles between bland and unscrupulous. I really like Robert Anton Wilson. He also went by the name Ra, because it was R-A-W, his initials. So he's the other Ra. And he said that belief systems were aptly named because they're BS. Everyone has their BS, right? We all have these default. Yeah, I kind of guessed you would, Pockets. Yeah, I've read all the cosmic triggers. I keep buying them and gifting them to people. I think I first read the Cosmic Trigger series when I was 14 years old, which to this day, 25 years later, 26, 27 years later, I still believe is like the optimal age to read them. But really, any age is appropriate. And obviously, Prometheus Rising and Quantum Psychology, and then I read his Illuminatus trilogy, and then I read the other Illuminatus books. Those are smutty. I'm just going to say it. But and then I read what else did I read? Oh, I read his Schrodinger's Cat. Those were great. I still love how that book begins. He begins by saying, there is a planet called Terra, and there are these Terrans who, he talks all about their society. He says, this book is not about them. This book is about the minority of Terrans that went by the name human. And you realize he was talking about insects. Like when he talks about the Terrans, he's like, the majority of living creatures. And then he talks about the humans, and he goes, and the humans had a companion who became known as the canine. And the humans taught their canine companions human qualities like fear, anxiety, guilt, and shame. And the canines taught the humans canine qualities such as honor, dignity, loyalty, love. Like, this is so great. Like, he takes a very cosmic perspective. But anyway, yeah, Robert Anton Wilson, just fantastic writer. But I'm not sure how we got on all that. But in any case, yeah, I'd love to see his body graph at some point. The other Ra. But yeah, so when it comes to, yeah, how did we get on it again? Maybe we're talking about the lines. Well, in any case, unconscious Jupiter. We'll get back to the unconscious Jupiter. So how do you get out of the toggle between planned and unscrupulous? How to, not that you personally need to, but how does one who has 48 in Jupiter, in the design Jupiter, get out of it? And really get to that higher place. And 48 has a key. The 48 key is resourcefulness. Being very, very resourceful, or resourceful, as people sometimes say. I don't know why they pronounce it that way. But yeah, there's these 48s. I mean, it is like having your bucket of solutions. That 1858 is sort of the drip, drip, drip of solutions, and that 48 has all these solutions. And so they can be very resourceful. And remembering that you have that resourcefulness that's going to get you out of the pinging between being bland and unscrupulous, and really get you to a different attitude around wealth, and a different attitude around money, and a different attitude around abundance. Remembering how resourceful you are, that is your key to abundance. And of course, all the fears of abandonment and things that can flare up, you now have that master key of precision. So you know that you can be very precise about the ways you are actually, resourceful. You have this key, so you don't have to just say ambiguously, I'm resourceful about everything. No, you can be very precise. You can say, I'm resourceful in this way, and this way, and this way, and these are exactly the things that I can do. And where does that ultimately lead? It ultimately leads to wisdom. And that's the high vibe of 48. And because it's a first line, right? We're on the first line here. That can also lead to all of that comfort with fear and being a rock and all of that stuff, being a real authority. So yeah, that unconscious Jupiter wealth attitude. I mean, this is a real aspect of making money and having enough abundance, and how you make money and how you attract wealth, and you do it by being resourceful. But you can't be resourceful if you're in that lower vibe where you're afraid of confrontation and afraid to stand up for yourself and constricted and things like that, which are the sort of the lower forms of that first line. But knowing you have that key of being resourceful. And then for Nancy, her design Jupiter, her wealth attitude is 38 too. So we already looked at 38, of course. That was, we looked at that as Pocket's personality Venus. But we'll return to 38 now. And so sign Jupiter, wealth attitude, just typing it up, 38-2, and 38 low foundational vibe is, we already looked at that, the pinging between defeatist and aggressive. And so this is going to be the sort of fundamental filter through which wealth is processed. Either nothing can be done or aggression. Now, again, I want to clarify, I'm not saying that this is Nancy's attitude. I experience both of you. I experience everyone on this call as very high vibe, so I really don't think most of you are down in here, but no matter how high vibe we are, we get triggered into that. You know, I was on a very high vibe at the conference, and Saturday night rolls around, and certain things can trigger deep abandonment issues and deep core wounds and so on, and we can get to a very negative place. And that's something that can really, we don't really, that's part of the no choice. We don't really get, like, it can strike at any time, and so these are the keys that help us get out of that. When we are spiraling in that low foundational vibe, when we are feeling, in this case, defeatist to aggressive to defeatist to aggressive. Second line, Chetan Parkin gives it one of his keynotes for that is anger. I would never have really thought of that keynote for the second line. It's certainly not one of Ra's keynotes for the second line. Obviously, Ra associates anger more with the manifestor type. But I have seen second lines be angry because anger can be a real projection outward in the way that the second line does. And I can definitely see the obliviousness and some of the other second line qualities that Chetan Parkin gives, some of the keynotes he gives to the second line. He gives the keynote of unaware, angry, oblivious, eating disorders. What's funny is we haven't found a single fourth line yet. None of these have been fourth lines. None of our Mars and Venus and Jupiter. Are we going to get to a fourth line? Do we have any fourth lines coming up? It doesn't look like it. Yeah, no fourth lines. It's so interesting. Well, we'll save that for another time. But yeah, this 38 low foundational vibe, defeatist, aggressive, second line, oblivious, angry. And then what is the key? We already saw this key with Pocket's personality Venus. The key is perseverance. So perseverance is really what's going to unlock the higher version, the higher vibe of that wealth attitude. And perseverance ultimately leads to honor. And then ultimately leads to the higher, more evolved forms of the second line, the naturalness, the comfort with oneself, with being oneself, the curiosity about others, the playful nature, the relaxed nature. So yeah, having a wealth attitude that's ultimately here to be playful. Having a wealth attitude that's here to be relaxed. Having a wealth attitude that's not, that's not stuck in obliviousness, like the obliviousness to wealth, but actually being willing to look at it, but looking at it in a way that's playful and that's curious. That's sort of the trajectory of the second line, because at a low vibe, it's like, I won't even look at it. I won't even think about it. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to know where it comes from or where it goes. Right? But then the higher vibe is kind of like, oh, I will look at it, but I can look at it with curiosity and with playfulness and in a relaxed way, in a natural way. I don't have to have the same attitude towards wealth that other people have, where they're so anxious and holding on to it or freaked out about it or making up stories about it or any of this stuff. I can look at it in a very natural, relaxed way, but I don't have to not look at it, because that's part of what the second line grows towards, is being able to look at things, not wanting to keep the blinders on and be oblivious to it. So that's the unconscious Jupiter, the wealth attitude. We have just a few more here in the notes. So now we're going to look at the unconscious Mars again. And the unconscious Mars again is now seen through a different light. So now that we've kind of come back out, we've threaded our way back up, we've looked at the wealth attitude, we can return to this core wound, to this abandonment, and we can give it a new keynote of embracing abandonment. So we're going to look now only at the key. So before we were looking at all of the keynotes, we were looking at the low vibe, the high vibe, Now we're just going to look at the key. So the key of the unconscious Mars. So for pockets, we had not discernment. That's mine. It's precision. Precision. It's almost like discernment. So pockets, we have precision. Nancy, we have realism. And so these are the keys that we now look at. This is how you embrace abandonment. We don't even look at where the key leads. We just this is just like a way to remember. And I'm going to actually, so I don't have to scroll up so much, I'm going to share these again. And so, yeah, that pockets design Mars in 62, Nancy design Mars in 60. And yeah, 62 precision, 60 realism. So we've now returned to the theme of abandonment, but it's embracing abandonment and sort of using this new tool, the new master key, the precision and the realism here. Then we look at the unconscious Venus, but we give it a new keynote. Instead of instilled love, instead of unconscious love, we now call it healing love. So we're going to return again, and instead of looking at all of them, now we're just going to look at the key and the high vibe. So the key and the high vibe, this is the design Venus. For pockets, this is gate 18. This is integrity and perfecting. And for Nancy, this is 10. And so we looked at that before. This is now naturalness and being. And so we look at the key and we look at the high vibe there, and we see that now that we've returned to that unconscious Venus, it's no longer the instilled love, it's no longer even the unconscious love. This is sort of the aspect of love, healing love in our life, like healing any of our pains around love, anything that needs to be healed, anything that's been wounded, any of our wounds around love. That pockets heals those wounds through integrity that leads to perfecting. Nancy heals those wounds through naturalness that leads to being. And now we look at conscious Mars again. And this is an interesting one. You know, conscious Mars, we started as personal defense, and then we made it as defense awareness, right? Wasn't it defense awareness was the next one? And now we're returning to conscious Mars, only looking at the keys and the high vibe, and we're calling it playfulness in life. And I really like this. This is something, you know, Chetan Parkin said, is that when you've really healed some of the defenses, that defense is actually a form of playfulness, that somebody oversteps boundaries and you actually get to play with them a little bit, that somebody encroaches, and instead of going ballistic on them, you have a sort of a way of playfully defending yourself, or even just achieving playfulness, that it is a form of play, that play is the play of boundaries, the play of borders, that all of this is a form of playfulness. And, oh, I'm not comfortable with you here on my border. Well, maybe you won't be comfortable if I'm on that border. And how do we do this playful jujitsu dance that negotiates our boundaries? And so that playfulness in life, so, you know, again, we're only going to look at the key and the high vibe. And so for pockets, that playfulness, that conscious Mars is 64. And 64, of course, is imagination and illumination. And for Nancy, that is 25. And 25 was acceptance and universal love. So this is how we experience playfulness in life. That pockets can experience the full playfulness of the imagination, which leads to illumination. And for Nancy, that acceptance itself is playful. What happens if I accept this? What happens if I use acceptance in a playful way, not as some serious thing, like I guess it's just the way it is, I have to accept it, but in a playful way, like surprising and disarming someone by accepting it. And they're going, wait, I didn't think you were going to accept that, but being playful in that acceptance. It's a nice approach, right? It changes it. It changes it a little bit when we see that acceptance can be a form of playfulness in life. Now we return to conscious Venus, or I guess personality Venus. I've been using the terms personality and conscious interchangeably. So personality Venus, we looked at this before a couple times now, right? This was our patterns of relating, our relating patterns, how we started this whole thing. It was also our love awareness. And now we're going to conscious Venus, to personality Venus with the keynote of clear relating. And so again, we're going to look at the key and the high vibe of this. And for pockets, this is 38. And 38 we have as perseverance and honor. So this is how to clearly relate. You can clearly relate by persevering and being honorable in your relations. That's how to have clear relating. That's how to keep it clear, to keep it in that clear place. And then for Nancy, her clear relating happens through 17. And 17 is farsightedness and omniscience. So through her great talent of being omniscient, her great siddhi, as they call it in the gene keys, and through her farsightedness, she can keep the relating extremely clear. So this is something we need. I mean, we were talking earlier about how quarter of duality and all of this stuff, that duality gets so confusing. And how do you keep it clear? You know, how do you relate to the other person? How do you bond to the other person in a clear way? Well, for pockets, her key is perseverance, and that leads to this honorable clarity of relating. And for Nancy, her key is farsightedness, which is the omniscience needed to keep things clear. Now we return to the unconscious Jupiter, to the design Jupiter, and it has the new keynote of wealth alignment. So we can see that it's not just your wealth attitude, it's how do you align yourself to wealth? How do you actually align yourself to the wealth that is in your life? And again, we're looking at the key and the high vibe. And so for pockets, that was resourcefulness. I remember that. And I'll check what this was 48. Yeah, resourcefulness and wisdom. So that is how you align yourself to wealth, not just your attitude about wealth, not just I have an attitude I'm resourceful, but how do I actually align myself to wealth and to abundance and to all of these jovial qualities? And that ultimately leads to wisdom. And then for Nancy, her wealth alignment is through 38. And we've looked at 38 quite a bit now, but yeah, perseverance and honor. And so perseverance is the key for Nancy to have in alignment with the jovial qualities, the Jupiterian qualities of wealth. Who knows the etymology of Jupiter here? Ju, it's like soup du jour, of the day, and pater, it's father. So Jupiter is the day father. The day father brings the wealth and brings the abundance. It's the abundance of the sun. Ultimately, the sun brings us all of our wealth, growing the crops in the ground and all of that. And now we return to the unconscious Mars. We don't even look at the key. We've already looked at the key, right? We've already seen the key. We've already seen that value. But now we go to the design Mars, the unconscious Mars, and we give it a new keynote of reconnecting and freedom. Reconnecting and freedom. And we just look at the highest vibe possible of the design Mars. And for pockets, this is impeccability. And for Nancy, this design Mars in gate 60 is justice. So this is the ultimate outcome and the ultimate way of reconnecting in freedom at the highest vibe. That pockets reconnects in freedom through impeccability, and Nancy reconnects in freedom through justice. And this is sort of the highest possible expression of what we earlier looked at as the core wound. But now we see that it's not just the core wound, that abandonment is not just abandonment, and is not just embracing abandonment. It's actually reconnecting in freedom, and how powerful that is to reframe the notion of abandonment as freedom. And this feeling of abandonment being so disconnected and having no connection, but now we see we actually do get to reconnect, but reconnect in freedom, which I understand as without all the baggage. Right? When you've healed that core wound, that deep abandonment, and you have that master key, now you can reconnect in freedom without all the baggage we bring of you abandoned me, or I've been abandoned, or nobody cares about me, and all of that. And then the last one we're going to look at today is the conscious Jupiter. So we're going to look at personality Jupiter. And we haven't looked at personality Jupiter yet. This is our first time looking at it, and then we'll wrap up. It looks like pretty much right on time. And we're going to look at the key and the high vibe. Personality Jupiter is exalted essence. And this is sort of where we're able to get to that place of abundance and that place of where we are the wealth, right? We are the exalted essence. It's just like in Cards of the Magi, where the Sun-Jupiter position is the most exalted and the Jupiter-Jupiter position is kind of the luckiest and so on. This is the exalted essence. And so looking at the personality Jupiter for pockets, this is in gate 50. And we're only looking at the keys and the high vibe. This is the exalted essence. So this is equilibrium and harmony. And then for Nancy, the exalted essence, we're looking at gate 60. And this is realism and justice. And so this is finally where we kind of end up. That having gone through this almost purification ritual, right? Having gone through this process of weaving our chart together and kind of sewing it together in an interesting way and following this whole line that returns back to the same places again in a new light. Where do we end up? Where's the exalted essence? It's the equilibrium that leads to harmony for pockets. Her exalted essence as somebody who brings equilibrium and brings harmony. And for Nancy, it is realism and justice. And seeing that is the exalted essence that she then brings into the world. And how cleanly that can come out when the rest of the pieces are all sort of woven together. I think of Tantra, where the name Tantra means to weave, the weaving. And that's kind of what we've done today. We've done a little tantric alchemy, weaving together the Karmagraph in a way you maybe haven't looked at it before. So I think that's it for me. If anyone has any final comments, anything they'd like to share or talk about. Otherwise, I really appreciate you being here. Yeah, thank you for that comment, Pockets. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Hi. So I did that karma clearing and I left and it was great, but I had a lot of confusion, which Mars, so it makes sense. But you really brought this home for me in a way that was really great. So thank you.
Thank you. It's
for
been
going
nice
through
for me
this.
to go over it too. This is the first time I've really come over it, done it again deeply, but I've looked at it a couple times and I really think it takes time to sink in. I mean, each of these words is so profound, and that's right. You were there. This whole time I'm doing it. I'm giving you something, but you were there with. It's probably good I didn't know you were there. I would have been self-conscious. No, I mean I did, but I just
No, but it's all good.
Yeah.
I needed this to
Well, yeah,
really
and
integrate it. I think the
I
way that you were talking about it and explaining it really helped me understand.
yeah, and he was doing other things too. I mean, you were there. He did
Mm-hmm.
guided meditation, and he kind of had a different approach to it. I was trying to do this, but in a way that's respectful to Chetan, but also using the formulas he's developed because it's pretty powerful. I mean, it's a very powerful way. I really like some of the choices he made in structuring to return to the same placements is so, I mean, because, I would never think of that. I would think oh yeah, let's go into
Yeah.
this and just kind of do it linear. But he does it and then he goes back and then he goes forward again. Then he goes back again. He does this rinse repeat structure and even that's what we did again. You already went through the original and now we've gone through it again. And that there is a sort of
Mm-hmm.
repetition that I think deepens it. So yeah,
Agreed. Great. Really great.
yeah.
Thank you, Jonah.
Did you get, just as a quick question, did you get to attend either of Raphael's healing sessions? I know you weren't there
I
in the second
didn't.
one. You didn't? Okay.
I was not. No, I was doing the past life regression at the
Oh, that's
time.
right.
But
That was
I
also
really,
recently.
really want to though.
Well, next time you're
I'll
here, and
definitely be.
also I can
Yeah.
send it to you. I just uploaded the first one he did, and we have the second one as well. So I'll be sharing some of
Awesome.
those links. And if I forget or anything, you can always message me, and just say, hey, Jonah, can
Great.
you send me that link? And I'll be happy to. So
I look forward to it. Thank you.
wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate everyone taking the time. I know we've spent about 3 hours on this, and really appreciate sticking around and going through it. It definitely is it was quite a lot to go through, and I hope that it's given you some. I covered 4 seasons. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Wonderful. And thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much. And I saw you emailed me, so I'll check your email as well. I'm going to go to the park with Dreama. She just messaged to ask if we're still on. We have a sort of standing sunset date at the park. So I go with my mom, and she brings her dog Chase, and yeah, I know, and we go walk by the river pretty much every night for sunset. So she just checked in if I'm still going. I will definitely give her a hug for you. I'll tell her it's from you, and yeah, I'm also going to talk to her about potential travel in a couple months here. So I'll get back to you about that, Nancy. And thank you so much for sharing that. So wonderful. Well, this has been a really sweet time. Thanks for sticking around, Richard. I know Brandy was tuning in, or maybe is still tuning in. I got your message, Brandy, and so I really appreciate that as well. And I appreciate you as well, Lucita. Au revoir. Absolutely. Looking forward to catching up more soon. Okay. Have a great evening, everyone.